I had been planning the trip for a long time. It was not about relaxation or about finding peace. I wanted to test myself, to see what it would feel like to be deep in the woods, far from roads, far from towns, far from the noise that crowds life. I picked a place after staring at maps for weeks. It was a stretch of forest in the mountains that had no trails marked, only fire roads that ended miles before where I wanted to go. It was the kind of place where you could walk for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up took most of the day. By the time I reached the last stretch of dirt road, the sun was already hanging low behind the ridges. The truck rattled over stones and mud ruts, and branches scraped the sides as if the forest wanted to keep me out. When I finally pulled off at a small opening just wide enough to park, I killed the engine and sat for a while. The silence pressed in fast, heavier than I expected. I heard only the ticking of the cooling engine and the faint drip of water from somewhere deeper in the trees. I packed my bag with more care than I usually did. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, extra water, knife, flashlight, spare batteries, everything in its place. I carried more than I needed because I knew once I left the road behind, there was no quick return. My plan was to hike about 5 miles in, find a spot by the stream I had seen on the map, and make camp there. The trail wasn't really a trail. It was a faint line where animals probably walked, and I had to push branches aside as I moved. The forest was thick, with dark pines rising in close ranks, their needles soaking up the last of the daylight. The ground was soft with layers of old needles, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything. As I hiked, I noticed how quickly the forest swallowed the road behind me. After only 20 minutes, it felt like I had been walking for hours. I didn't stop until the light started to fade. I reached the stream just before sunset. It was narrow, no wider than a few feet, but the water was clear and fast, running over rocks polished smooth. I chose a flat patch of ground a short distance from the bank. I set my pack down and worked quickly to get the tent up before the dark pressed in. When night came, it came fast. The trees blocked most of the sky, leaving only small patches of dim light where stars peeked through. The forest grew cold, and the silence became a living thing. I cooked a small meal, ate it without hurry, and cleaned up carefully. I had read enough about camping deep in the woods to know not to leave scraps or smells behind. Afterward, I sat for a while outside the tent, staring into the dark, listening. At first, I heard only the stream and the occasional flutter of wings in the trees. But after some time, other sounds crept in. Cracks of branches somewhere far off, something moving through leaves, a low, steady rhythm like footsteps, but too far to be sure. Each time I turned my head, the sound stopped. When I finally crawled into the tent and zipped it closed, I lay there wide awake, my ears sharp for every noise. Sleep came in short bursts. I woke often, my heart racing, convinced something was outside. Once, I heard what sounded like breathing just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I held still, gripping the knife I had kept next to me, but the sound faded, replaced again by silence. By morning, I was exhausted, though I had barely moved from where I had laid down. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I boiled water, ate, and packed a smaller bag with food and gear for exploring. My plan was to follow the stream deeper into the woods, see how far I could go, then return by late afternoon. The forest was beautiful in daylight, but it never felt open. The trees grew tight, their branches locking together overhead, and the undergrowth pressed close around me. Every so often, I would stop and look behind, making sure I remembered the way back. The deeper I went, the less I heard of birds. The forest became quiet again, the same thick silence from the night before. I kept following the stream until the ground began to rise, forcing me to climb over rocks slick with moss. I stopped at a small clearing where sunlight spilled through, and I sat for a while, eating. That was when I noticed something strange. Across the stream, half hidden under branches, was a shape that did not belong. It was cut wood too straight to be natural. I crossed carefully, pushing through thorns until I stood in front of it. It was the remains of a cabin, old and rotted, the roof fallen in, the walls leaning. The forest had started to take it back, roots breaking through the floorboards, moss covering what was left of the logs. Inside, the air smelled damp and sour. A rusted stove lay on its side, half buried in dirt. A broken chair slumped in a corner. I walked through slowly, my boots sinking into the soft floor. In the back, against the wall, I found something that made me pause. It was a bed frame, and on it, the shape of a blanket, moldy and eaten away by insects. For a second, I thought I saw the outline of something beneath it, but when I touched it with my boot, it collapsed into dust. I stood there uneasy. The cabin was long abandoned, that much was clear, but something about it felt wrong. It was the kind of place where the air seemed heavier, where you felt watched even when no one was there. I didn't stay long. I left the way I had come, but as I walked back along the stream, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. When I returned to camp, the light was already fading again. I set about making food, but my thoughts kept returning to the cabin. Who had built it and why had they left it to rot? How long had it been there? I sat by the stream, the sound of water filling the space around me, but I couldn't relax. When night came, I lay in the tent, waiting for the silence to close in again. This time, the sounds came quicker. Branches breaking, something heavy moving through the brush. Not close, but not far either. I held still, my hand on the knife again. The noises moved around the camp in slow arcs, circling, pausing, then moving again. I wanted to believe it was animals, but the rhythm of it was too steady. The steps seemed measured, deliberate. At one point, a rock hit the ground not far from the tent. My chest tightened. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would leave. I told myself I came here to test myself, and I had done enough. The woods were not welcoming. They pressed too close, and whatever moved out there was not something I wanted to keep near. I packed everything quickly, stuffing it into the bag without the care I had taken before. The hike back felt different. I knew the way, but every turn in the stream, every dark stand of trees felt like it could hide something. I walked fast, barely stopping to drink water. The forest seemed to follow me with its sounds. Once, I looked back and thought I saw movement between the trees, a flash of dark against darker, but when I stopped, there was nothing. When I finally saw the road again, the relief was so strong my knees nearly gave. My truck sat where I had left it, quiet, waiting. I threw the pack in the back and climbed in, locking the doors even though I was alone. I sat for a while before starting the engine, staring into the trees, trying to understand what it was that had made the woods feel so wrong. As I drove away, I realized it wasn't the cabin or the noises alone. It was the knowledge that someone had been there before me, far enough from roads and trails to be forgotten. Whoever had built that cabin had chosen to live where no one else went. They had left it behind, but the forest still held on to their presence. And as I thought back to the measured steps circling my camp, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I hadn't been alone. When I reached town later that night, with the glow of lights and the sound of cars around me again, I felt the tension ease. But deep down, I knew the woods were still there, endless and dark, holding whatever it was that had moved outside my tent. I would never forget the way it sounded, slow and careful, like it had all the time in the world, and I knew I wouldn't be going back. I never planned to go that far into the woods. My idea was just to spend a few nights camping in a quiet place away from the noise of town. Somewhere I could sit by a fire and listen to the trees moving in the wind, maybe walk some trails during the day. I packed simple gear, tent, sleeping bag, a hatchet, some food, a few bottles of water, and a map I had printed. I knew these woods were big and people sometimes got lost here, but I told myself I would stick close to marked paths. That promise to myself did not last long. When I first parked my car on the side of the gravel forest road and carried my backpack down a narrow path, everything felt normal. The sun was out, the air smelled like pine, and the woods were full of small sounds, birds, leaves falling, the crunch of my boots on the trail. I kept walking deeper, telling myself I wanted to get far enough where I would not hear any cars or see anyone else. I wanted complete quiet, That was my mistake, because quiet in the woods is never what you think it will be. By the time I picked a spot for camp, the sun was dropping lower. I found a flat area with enough space to pitch my tent, just off what looked like an old trail. The grass was pressed down in places, and I thought maybe animals had come through, but I didn't think too much about it. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. As the light faded, the woods took on a different tone. The cheerful daytime sounds turned into long silences broken by sudden sharp noises. A branch snapping somewhere off in the dark felt louder than it should have. I tried to ignore it. That first night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside my tent, slow and dragging. But when I sat up and held my breath, there would only be silence. I told myself it was deer or raccoons moving around, but my heart didn't believe it. Every time I started to doze off, some sound would jolt me awake again. By morning, my eyes burned from lack of rest. I made coffee on my little camp stove and walked a bit to stretch my legs. The forest in daylight looked normal again, harmless almost, and I wondered why I had been so tense the night before. I decided to hike deeper, just for the day, and then return to camp by evening. I left some of my gear in the tent to travel lighter and carried only water, a knife, and some snacks. At first, the hike felt good. The woods grew thicker the farther I went, with tall trees blocking out the sun and patches of heavy undergrowth that forced me to step carefully. There were no trail markers here, and I started to realize I might not be following any official path anymore. The ground looked worn in some places, but it was hard to tell if people had made it or if it was just where animals traveled. After hours of walking, I found something strange. In a clearing, there was a pile of broken branches arranged in a way that didn't look natural. They were leaned together like a rough shelter, but not big enough for a person to use. It looked more like something left behind, maybe half-finished or abandoned. I stood there staring at it, wondering if someone else had built it recently. The wood wasn't rotten. I felt watched while I stood there, though I couldn't explain why. I decided not to linger. I turned back, thinking I would retrace my steps to camp, but after a while I realized the trees looked different. I tried to remember landmarks, but everything blended together. I walked faster, trying to find something familiar, but the more I moved, the less I recognized. The light through the trees shifted, and I knew the day was ending. Panic started creeping in when I couldn't locate my camp before dark. I kept walking, refusing to admit I was lost, but eventually I had to stop. I dropped my pack and sat on a fallen log. My throat was dry, my legs ached, and the shadows were closing in. I decided I would stay put for the night and start fresh in the morning. I didn't have my tent or sleeping bag, only my jacket, so I pulled it tight around me and tried to rest. That night was worse than the first. The noises in the woods were constant. At one point, I heard something heavy moving through the brush, not far from where I sat. The sound of it made my chest tighten. It wasn't a deer. It was too deliberate. I gripped my knife and stayed perfectly still, hoping it would pass. The movement circled for a long time before fading into the distance. I never saw what it was. By dawn, I was shivering, hungry, and desperate. I tried again to find my camp, walking in what I thought was the same direction as yesterday, but nothing matched. Hours passed. The trees seemed endless. My water was running low, and I knew dehydration would come quickly if I didn't find a stream. By afternoon, I heard trickling and followed the sound until I reached a narrow creek. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I filled my bottle, filtered it, and drank until my stomach hurt. As I rested there, I saw something across the creek that froze me in place. On the far bank, half hidden by brush, was another shelter of sticks, larger this time, built low to the ground. Around it, scraps of fabric hung from branches, faded, torn pieces of clothing. My skin prickled. It didn't look abandoned long ago. The fabric fluttered as if someone had hung it there recently. I backed away slowly, every instinct telling me not to go closer. For the rest of the day, I moved in the opposite direction, trying to put distance between myself and that place. I thought maybe I was heading toward a road, but all I found were more trees, more silence. As night fell again, I built a small fire with the few matches I had left and kept it burning as long as possible. The firelight gave me comfort, but it also made me feel exposed. I imagined eyes watching me from just beyond the glow. Sleep came in short bursts. At one point, I woke to the sound of something moving close. The fire had died down, and the woods were nearly black. I listened hard and heard steady breathing, not mine, off to the side. When I snapped a branch to toss into the fire, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning, I forced myself to keep moving. My stomach cramped with hunger. I ate the last of my food and chewed pine needles just to have something in my mouth. Around midday, I stumbled onto a path, narrow, but definitely a path. Relief filled me, but it faded when I noticed the footprints in the dirt. They were human, bare, and fresh. The toes dug into the soil as if someone had been walking without shoes, and the tracks led deeper into the woods. I didn't want to follow, but I had no choice. Paths usually lead somewhere. I walked carefully, every noise behind me making me whip my head around. After an hour, the trail led me to another clearing. In the center was a circle of stones blackened by old fires. Bones were scattered around, some small, maybe from animals, others larger. I couldn't bring myself to look closely enough to know for sure. The air there was heavy, and I felt sick. I turned and left fast, crashing through brush until my legs gave out. I dropped to the ground, heart racing. My hands shook as I held my knife, expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. But no one did. The woods stayed silent. That was the lowest point. I realized then I wasn't just lost. Someone else was out there, building shelters, leaving signs, maybe watching me. I had wandered into the wrong part of the forest, and I needed to get out before night came again. With what little strength I had left, I forced myself to keep moving west, where the sun was heading. I pushed through undergrowth, climbed small rises, and ignored the pain in my feet. Hours dragged by, but eventually the trees began to thin. I heard the faint sound of cars in the distance, soft at first, then clearer. My chest filled with hope I hadn't felt in days. When I finally broke through the tree line, I stumbled onto another gravel road. I dropped to my knees, overwhelmed. The sight of tire tracks in the dirt was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I followed the road until a truck appeared, and I waved it down, my voice hoarse, my body filthy and shaking. The driver stared at me wide-eyed but let me climb in. I never went back for my camp. I never wanted to. To this day, I don't know who built those shelters or why the footprints were bare, or what was circling me at night. All I know is that I got out alive. The woods are not empty, no matter how far you go. Someone is always out there, and sometimes you are not meant to find them. I decided to go alone into the deep woods late in September, when the air started to change and the days were shorter but not yet bitterly cold. I had always liked being out in nature by myself, but that time I wanted to go farther than I normally did. I wanted to test myself a little. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, food for 4 days, extra clothes, water filter, and a map. The forest I went into stretched for miles with almost no houses, no trails except for some old logging roads that were slowly being eaten back by the trees. It was the kind of place where once you stepped far enough in, you could go hours without hearing or seeing another person. That was part of why I chose it. I thought the silence would clear my head. The first day was fine. I parked my truck near the edge of the tree line, locked it, and set out with everything strapped to my back. The sun was out, the air cool, the smell of pine and damp dirt strong as soon as I left the road behind. The woods were thick. Tall trees rose up everywhere, trunks close together, branches shutting out much of the sky. I walked steadily, following a faded path for the first hour until it became nothing but flattened leaves. From there, I just kept a compass bearing and moved deeper, marking some trees with a small hatchet so I could retrace my way if I had to. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The sound of the occasional bird, the rush of wind through the canopy, my own boots crunching over roots and rocks. After about 6 hours, I stopped to set up camp in a small clearing. I pitched my tent, cooked a little food, and sat by a small fire until the dark closed in around me. There was nothing strange then, just the usual shifting noises of the forest at night. Branches cracked sometimes, animals moved through the undergrowth, but I told myself it was all normal. I slept fairly well, though I woke a couple of times from the silence pressing in on the thin nylon walls of the tent. The second day I went farther. I left my campsite packed up and carried everything with me. I wanted to go until I felt sure I was truly in the middle of nowhere. That day the ground got rougher. Hills rose and fell, slopes slick with wet leaves. I crossed a stream that forced me to take off my boots and wade through. The water was cold enough to bite at my skin. Around noon I stopped for a quick meal, sitting on a log and staring at the endless trees. It felt both freeing and unsettling. The farther I went, the more it hit me that there was no easy way out if something went wrong. By late afternoon I reached another clearing, this one larger. It looked like an old logging site long abandoned. Some stumps still stood gray and splintered, covered in moss. I decided to set up there since it was flat ground. I built my fire, cooked again, and watched the flames. When the sun sank, the woods went from dark green to black. That night felt different. I couldn't explain it clearly, but the noises around me carried sharper, closer. At one point while lying in my tent, I heard steady footsteps crunching leaves. Heavy, slow. My chest tightened and I held still. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a bear, though the sound carried a weight that felt wrong for an animal. The steps stopped near the edge of the clearing. I lay frozen, waiting, every muscle tense. After a long minute, they moved off again into the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I pushed even farther, though part of me thought about turning back. My pride kept me moving. I told myself I came here to test myself, to see how far I could go. The woods grew thicker. Branches hung low and scratched my arms, my face. Thorns caught my clothes. The ground sloped downward into gullies and then up again into ridges. Around mid-morning, I found what looked like a rough trail. It wasn't marked on my map, but it was there, a faint depression through the leaves as if many feet had passed that way long ago. Something about it made me uneasy, though. It was narrow, unnatural in the way it cut straight rather than winding. I followed it for a while, curious, until it ended at a cluster of rocks. There was nothing else, just stone piled like the remains of a wall. Moss grew thick over it, and I could tell it hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. I left quickly, the back of my neck prickling as I walked away. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in. The light dimmed earlier than usual. I found another small clearing and set camp. I ate, drank some water I had filtered from a stream, and tried to calm myself. I kept thinking about the footsteps from the night before. I convinced myself it had to have been an animal. Still, when darkness fell, I couldn't relax. Every sound outside my tent seemed amplified. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Not an animal this time. I was sure of it. The steps circled part of the clearing, pausing, then moving again. I could hear the crunch of boots, not paws. My chest pounded so hard I thought the noise would give me away. I gripped the small hatchet I had beside me and waited. The steps stopped for a long while, then faded into the trees again. I lay awake till morning, barely moving, listening. On the fourth day, I made the decision to head back. I didn't care about pride anymore. I had gone far enough. I was tired, on edge, and the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. I packed quickly and started retracing my steps. The woods felt heavier than before. Every shadow seemed too deep. Every sound carried menace. I kept looking behind me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, a flicker of something between the trees, but whenever I stared hard, there was nothing. My nerves stretched tight as wire. By late afternoon, the sky grew darker with heavy clouds. Rain began to fall, soft at first and then harder. I pulled my hood up and kept going. The ground turned slick, mud sucking at my boots. I stumbled often, branches whipping into my face. I knew I wouldn't make it back to the truck that day. I had to set camp again, though the thought made me sick. I found a hollow between two ridges, sheltered slightly from the rain, and pitched my tent as fast as I could. The firewood was too wet, so I ate cold food in silence, water dripping around me. My clothes clung damp to my skin. That night was the worst. The rain slowed sometime past midnight, and the forest grew unnervingly quiet. I was lying in my tent when I heard the sound again. Those same heavy steps, slow, deliberate, moving closer. I held my breath, heart hammering. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing this time, faint but steady. Whoever it was stood there for a long minute, not moving. My entire body shook as I gripped the hatchet in my fist, waiting for the tent flap to rip open. But it never did. After what felt like forever, the breathing faded, the steps moved off. I lay there in pure fear, unable to sleep, staring into the darkness until the faint light of dawn came. When morning broke, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. There were footprints in the mud, clear as day. Not animal, boots. They circled my tent, then trailed back into the trees. My stomach dropped. Someone had been watching me all night. I knew then I couldn't waste any more time. I stuffed everything into my pack and started moving fast, almost running. I didn't stop for food. I barely drank water. I just kept going, following my markings, pushing toward the direction of my truck. The woods pressed closer with each mile. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. Every so often I glanced back and thought I caught sight of movement. I couldn't be sure if it was real or my nerves playing tricks, but I didn't care. I kept going. Around midday, I heard something behind me, distant but distinct. A branch snapping under weight, followed by another. Someone was following, keeping pace. I tried to move faster, almost stumbling into a run. Hours later, exhausted, I reached the faint trail where I had first entered the deeper woods. Relief surged through me. I followed it quickly, desperate now. The light was dim again, clouds covering the sky, but I didn't stop. When I finally broke out near the dirt road where I had left my truck, I nearly collapsed. My hands shook as I dug for the keys. The truck stood just where I had left it, mud splattered, silent. I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and climbed behind the wheel. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the tree line. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing between the trees, still watching. Then the engine roared and I pulled away down the road, not looking back again. The drive out felt endless. My body ached, my throat dry, but I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away, where lights and people reminded me I wasn't alone anymore. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, heart still pounding. Whoever had followed me out there had never shown their face, never spoken, never attacked. But they had been there night after night, circling my camp, standing outside my tent, waiting. I don't know what they wanted, and maybe I never will. But I know this: I will never go that deep into the woods alone again. The silence of those trees still lives in my head, and when I think about I never liked the word random because in my head nothing was ever really random. Things always happened for a reason, even if you couldn't see it right away. But that word was sitting in my mind the whole time I was out there, in those woods miles from the last paved road, with only a thin tent and a pack of supplies that didn't feel nearly enough. I told myself this trip was random. I told myself I had picked a random spot on the map, taken a random dirt road, stopped at a random pull-off, and walked in with no real plan. That word felt harmless when I started. By the end, it became something heavy, because all the little random choices lined up into one long night where I thought I might not come out alive. I had been driving back roads most of the morning. I wasn't looking for a campground or trailhead. I wanted to get away from people completely. I passed the last sign of any house when the road narrowed, with grass running up between the ruts. I pulled over on a spot that looked wide enough to turn around later, killed the engine, and sat for a while listening. The silence felt thick. No cars, no airplanes overhead, not even a distant dog barking. Just wind through trees and the faint click of insects. That was the first time I felt the weight of being truly alone. I loaded my pack with what I thought I'd need for a single night. Tent, sleeping bag, a little food, water bottles, headlamp, knife, lighter. I left most things in the car, figuring I'd only walk in far enough to lose sight of the road. I didn't measure the distance, but it was probably 1.5 miles before I decided I'd gone far enough. The trees had closed in, big pines mixed with old oaks, branches overlapping so heavy that the light dimmed even in mid-afternoon. The ground was uneven with moss-covered rocks, roots twisting like veins across the soil. I picked a flat patch near a fallen log and started setting up. Everything about it felt normal then. I put up the tent, stowed my food inside a bag, stretched my legs, and tried to breathe slow, as if this was exactly the peace I had come for. The quiet was still strange, though. I kept waiting to hear something. Another hiker, a plane, but there was nothing. The only sound was the wind, and sometimes that stopped too, leaving only the ringing of my own ears. I ate an early dinner from a can, rinsed out the spoon, and sat with my back against the log, watching shadows grow longer. I told myself I'd sleep early, hike back in the morning, and that was all. But the longer I sat, the more wrong it felt. I noticed small things first, like how every time I thought I heard a distant rustle, it stopped when I turned my head. Once, I thought I saw movement between the trunks, a darker shape against the dark bark. But when I stared long enough, it melted back into nothing. I tried to laugh at myself, but the sound was flat and weak. The shadows stretched until the trees looked like walls, and by the time I crawled into the tent, my chest already felt tight. Inside the thin nylon, the silence pressed even harder. I zipped the door closed, unrolled my sleeping bag, and lay down. The ground was hard, but it wasn't that keeping me awake. It was the tiny noises, the snap of a twig, the shuffle of something against leaves, the faint crunch of weight on soil. I kept telling myself it was normal. Squirrels, deer, raccoons. The woods were full of life, and none of it cared about me. But the longer I lay still, the more those sounds took on a pattern. It wasn't scattered. It wasn't random. It was slow, steady, circling. I propped myself up, holding my breath, straining to hear. A step, pause. Another step, then nothing. Minutes later, a faint crack behind me, as if something had shifted its weight. I gripped the knife I had brought, my hands slick with sweat. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my light out there, but the idea of facing empty woods with no one around to help froze me. I told myself it was an animal, a big one maybe, but animals didn't circle like that. They didn't move slow and stop when you stopped. They didn't mimic your silence. I must have stayed awake for hours, staring at the thin fabric walls of my tent, heart racing at every faint sound. Sometime deep in the night, I finally fell into a shallow sleep, the knife still clutched tight in my hand. I dreamed of nothing, just dark. When I woke, the air was colder. My watch said 3:17 a.m. The woods were so still I wondered if I had gone deaf. Then I realized what had woken me. The zipper. It wasn't loud, just a faint, careful pull, like fingers easing it down one tooth at a time. I froze, every muscle stiff. My knife was still in my hand. The zipper stopped halfway. I waited, lungs burning, and finally snapped my light on. The beam cut across the inside of the tent, glaring off nylon walls. No one was there. The zipper sat halfway down, the flap slightly open, cold air spilling in. My skin went hot then cold. I shoved it back up, locked it tight, and sat with my light on for the rest of the night, every second stretching like an hour. When dawn finally bled through the trees, I didn't pack slowly. I stuffed everything into my bag without order, yanked the tent stakes out, rolled the bundle into a mess, and shouldered it. I just wanted out. The trail back felt longer than before, every turn looking unfamiliar, though I knew I had followed the same line of broken branches and scuffed soil. Halfway back, I stopped dead. In the dirt ahead of me were footprints, not boots like mine, bare feet, long, narrow, with deep toe marks pressed into the mud. They faced the way I had come, leading straight toward where I had camped. My throat went dry. I crouched, staring at them, trying to think of another explanation. Maybe kids, though what kids would walk barefoot this deep in the woods? The prints looked fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain or wind. They were headed right to me, as if whoever left them had been following. I stood up fast, heart hammering, and started moving quicker. My bag bounced hard against my back, straps digging into my shoulders. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees. Relief hit me in a rush, but it didn't last. My car was there, but the driver's side door was hanging open. I hadn't left it that way. I dropped my pack and rushed forward, checking inside. The seats were tossed, glove box open, my maps scattered. Nothing valuable was gone because I hadn't brought much, but someone had been in there. The thought of them sitting in my car, maybe waiting, maybe watching me walk off into the woods, made my skin crawl. I slammed the door, threw my gear in the back, and started the engine with shaking hands. Driving out felt endless. Every shadow between trees looked like a figure. Every bend in the dirt road felt like a trap. My rearview mirror felt heavy, as if I'd see someone walking behind me, barefoot, calm, keeping pace. I didn't see anyone. I didn't stop until the road widened, turned to gravel, then pavement, then finally met the highway. Only then did my chest loosen enough for me to breathe. I didn't report it. What would I even say? That some stranger unzipped my tent, left barefoot prints in the dirt, and rifled through my car? The police would shrug. There was no proof, no crime worth their time. But I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me. Someone had followed me. Someone had stood just outside that thin layer of fabric while I slept, waiting for me to make a mistake. I told myself it was random, all of it. Random place, random night, random encounter. But I know better. Nothing out there was random. I chose that road. I chose that spot. I chose to sleep in the deep woods, thinking I was alone, and someone else chose to follow. That ending is the only clear part in my mind now. I was watched, hunted maybe, by another human being. No ghost, no animal, no trick of my imagination. Just someone who had been out there longer than me, barefoot and silent, who knew the woods better, who wanted me to know I was never really safe. I never went camping alone again. I don't know why I decided to go that far into the woods by myself. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride, or maybe I just wanted to see how quiet the world could get when there was nothing but trees around me. I had gone camping alone plenty of times before, but this trip was different. I didn't pick a campground, and I didn't pick a marked trail. I just drove until the road became dirt, followed that until it turned into little more than 2 ruts, and parked when I couldn't trust my car to push further without getting stuck. From there, I loaded everything into my pack and walked. First, it felt calm. The air smelled sharp with pine, and the ground under my boots was soft with old needles. The sun pushed through the trees in broken lines, shifting as the breeze moved the branches above. It was the kind of silence I craved. No cars, no people, no distant hum of anything, just the creak of the woods and my footsteps. I had packed heavy, maybe too heavy. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 4 days, water filter, flashlight, batteries, knife, small axe, tarp, and extra clothes. It was enough to last, but I could feel the pull on my shoulders as I hiked deeper. I followed no trail, just the slope of the land, letting my compass and the position of the sun guide me. I told myself I'd keep track, that I'd be careful, but after a few hours of pushing through brush and stepping over fallen trunks, everything started to look the same. The deeper I went, the thicker it felt, like the woods were swallowing me inch by inch. When I finally stopped, the light was already fading. The air was cooler, and the shadows stretched long between the trees. I found a small clearing, barely wide enough for my tent, with moss covering the ground and a dead log I could use as a seat. I dropped my pack and felt relief shoot through my shoulders. My shirt was damp from sweat, and when I pulled it off, the cool air bit at my skin. I set up camp carefully, laying the tarp, pitching the tent, and stacking my gear in neat order. I've always been strict about camp setup. If something happens, you don't want to scramble in the dark looking for a flashlight or your knife. After eating, I sat with my back against the log, staring into the thick wall of trees around me. The forest makes you feel both huge and small at once. Huge because there's no one else there, like the entire world is just yours. Small because when you hear a branch crack or the wind shift, you realize just how much can be hiding beyond the line of sight. The first night was rough. I lay in my tent, listening. The woods are never truly quiet. Branches fall without warning. Owls cry out. Animals move through the brush. Each sound pulled my eyes open, and I kept my knife close. At one point, I swore I heard something walking slowly, deliberate steps breaking sticks somewhere off in the dark. It wasn't a deer. Deer move light and fast. This was slow, careful, like someone placing their weight 1 foot at a time. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tight, waiting for it to come closer. But after a few minutes, the sound faded. By morning, I was more tired than before. The damp cold clung to me, and when I crawled out of the tent, the world was gray and heavy with fog. I boiled water for coffee and watched steam rise into the air that didn't seem to move. Something about that fog unsettled me. The trees were still there, but softer, blurred, as if they had grown closer overnight. I pushed further that day, leaving camp behind to explore. I kept a straight line as much as I could, marking trees with my knife as I passed. The woods grew denser, and the ground uneven, covered with roots and holes. I slipped once, catching myself with my hand against a rock, scraping my palm open. Blood welled up quickly, but I wrapped it and kept going. I didn't want to admit it, but every time I stopped, I thought I heard movement. It was never clear, never close, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. I found something strange that afternoon. A tree had fallen long ago, its roots torn from the dirt and left a dark pit behind. In the pit, there were bones. Small ones at first, then larger. They weren't human, but they were piled strangely, not scattered the way animals usually leave them. Something about the sight made me uneasy. I backed away and marked the spot in my head so I could avoid it on the way back. When I returned to camp, the fog had lifted and everything looked normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I ate quickly and tried to rest, but that night the sounds came back. The same slow movement, sometimes closer, sometimes further. I gripped my knife until my hand cramped, straining to hear. I thought about calling out, but the idea of letting whatever it was know exactly where I was made me freeze. The third day, I noticed something worse. My marks on the trees were gone. At first, I thought I had lost track, that maybe I had walked further than I remembered. But when I reached the clearing I had made camp in, I saw the bark. Where I had cut my knife into it, fresh shavings of wood were piled at the base. Someone had smoothed them out. Someone had erased them. I felt my stomach drop. The woods were no longer just woods. There was someone else out there. Someone who had followed me, close enough to know where I had marked my path, close enough to touch the trees after I passed. The rest of the day I stayed near camp. I gathered wood, checked my gear, and kept scanning the trees. I told myself maybe it was nothing, maybe I had marked different trees than I remembered, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. That night was worse than the others. I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I woke to faint noises, the soft crunch of leaves, the slow snap of branches. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move between two trees, taller than it should have been, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the fourth morning, I knew I had to leave. The food in my pack was fine, my water filter still good, but my mind was cracking. I packed everything as fast as I could and started walking back. Only this time, nothing looked right. The ground sloped differently, the trees pressed closer, and the sun was hidden by clouds, making it harder to judge direction. I tried to use my compass, but the needle spun erratically, twitching back and forth as if something was interfering with it. Hours passed. My shoulders burned under the weight of my pack, and my throat was dry. I stopped once, kneeling to filter water from a stream, but even then, I kept looking over my shoulder. I was sure I wasn't alone. At one point, I saw footprints in the mud along the bank. Not mine. Bigger, heavier, pressed deep like whoever made them carried weight. They followed the edge of the stream before disappearing into the trees. I pushed harder, panic driving me, ignoring the ache in my legs. The woods seemed endless. No roads, no trails, nothing familiar. As the sun dropped again, I knew I was stuck out for another night. I set camp hastily, barely pegging the tent before crawling inside. I didn't cook, didn't even light a fire. I just sat in the dark, listening. That night, the sounds came closer than ever. I could hear breathing outside my tent, slow and heavy, moving just beyond the thin wall of fabric. I clenched my knife so tight my knuckles ached. Every second dragged. I pictured the zipper sliding open, a shadow crouching low, a hand reaching inside. But nothing happened. Eventually, the breathing moved away, leaving me shaking in silence. When morning came, I didn't waste time. I shoved everything into my pack and started moving again. My body was exhausted, my eyes red from lack of sleep, but fear pushed me. Around noon, I finally caught sight of something. An old fence, rotted and broken, stretching through the woods. It meant people had been here once, long ago. I followed it, stumbling as roots caught my boots, until I saw a dirt road ahead. Relief nearly knocked me over. I broke from the trees, legs burning, and followed the road. It was empty, but I kept walking, refusing to stop. Eventually, I reached a small hunting cabin, boarded up but still standing. I sat on the steps, pack dropped at my feet, and felt the first real breath of relief I'd had in days. But the feeling didn't last. When I looked back at the edge of the woods, I saw movement. Someone stood there, half hidden by the trees, watching. Too far to make out a face, too still to be an animal. I froze, staring back, until finally, slowly, they stepped backward and vanished into the shadows. I stayed at that cabin until nightfall, too afraid to move further. When the darkness came, I barred the door with whatever I could find inside. I lay on the dusty floor, gripping my knife, knowing that whoever had followed me was still out there. The woods weren't empty, and I had gone too deep. I never thought much about the woods. They were always just there, endless trees stretching past the highway, dark patches I drove by without caring. But one summer, I decided I wanted to push myself further than I usually did. I had camped many times, but always at known campgrounds, safe places with trails, fire pits, and other campers scattered nearby. This time, I wanted something different. I wanted to see how it felt to go deep, away from marked trails, away from comfort. I picked a random forested area on the map, far from the places I had gone before. I didn't choose it for any reason except that it looked empty. I told myself it was about peace and quiet, but deep down, I think I wanted to test myself. I wanted to know what it felt like to be completely alone where no one could find me easily. I wanted to know if I could handle it. I left early in the morning with a backpack full of gear. I had packed light, but I made sure to bring the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, food, a knife, and a map. My phone had no signal where I was going, but I carried a small emergency radio. I didn't plan on using it. The road that led me there grew smaller the deeper I drove, and eventually it turned into dirt. I parked my car at a small pull-off, locked it, and started walking. The trees swallowed me quickly, their tall trunks blocking out most of the sunlight. The air smelled damp, earthy, and heavy with pine. The silence was deep. No highway noise, no people, just the occasional bird call and the crunch of my boots on the ground. I didn't pick a trail because there wasn't one. I just walked in, using my compass to keep track of direction. I told myself I would go 3 miles in before setting camp. That way, I would be far enough to feel the isolation. The woods thickened as I went. Branches scratched my arms, and I had to step over fallen logs and weave around thorn bushes. I sweated hard under my pack, but I kept going, telling myself this was the adventure I wanted. After hours of pushing through, I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was mostly flat, with soft moss covering the dirt. It seemed perfect for a tent. I set down my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and got to work. I set up the tent first, making sure it was tight and secure. Then I collected wood for a small fire. By the time I boiled water for a simple meal, The sun had already dropped low, painting the trees orange. I ate in silence, listening to the faint rustle of leaves high above. The air cooled quickly, and shadows grew long. That first night, I sat by the fire until it burned down to coals. The woods around me grew darker than I expected, darker than anything I had felt before. There were no distant cabin lights, no faint glow of towns, nothing. Just black trees pressing in, the stars barely peeking through the thick canopy. When I finally crawled into my tent, the silence hit me harder. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes open, hearing every sound. A branch cracked somewhere in the distance. Leaves shifted as something moved. I told myself it was just small animals, rabbits, raccoons, maybe deer. But in the middle of the night, everything feels bigger. Every sound feels close, almost inside the tent. I woke several times, heart pounding, certain I heard something walking slowly nearby. But when I listened harder, the sound was gone. I tried to calm myself, but sleep came only in short bursts. The morning brought relief. Sunlight cut through the trees, and the forest didn't feel as threatening. I cooked oatmeal, drank water, and told myself I just needed to get used to the deep silence. I decided to explore farther. I left my camp behind and walked deeper into the woods with only my day pack. The trees felt endless. I followed the compass, trying not to lose track of where I was. The farther I went, the less I saw of any kind of path. The forest floor was rough, covered in fallen branches and thick underbrush. After a couple of hours, I found something strange. At first, I thought it was just more fallen trees. But when I looked closer, I saw the remains of an old structure. Wooden beams, half rotted, lay collapsed on the ground. They were too squared to be natural. It looked like the ruins of a small cabin, maybe decades old. The wood was gray and soft with age. Nails stuck out, rusted and bent. Moss grew thick over the remains. I knelt and touched one of the beams, crumbled easily, leaving damp dust on my fingers. It gave me an uneasy feeling. Someone had once lived or stayed here, deep in these woods. Why had they built so far in? Why had they left it to rot? I looked around for signs of tools or objects, but there was nothing, just wood, slowly being eaten by the forest. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it, listening to the heavy silence around me. Then I forced myself to move on. The rest of the day, I wandered without finding much else. When I finally made it back to my camp, I felt tired but relieved to see my tent still there. I cooked, ate, and tried to relax. That night, the noises came back. At first, it was the usual small rustles, snaps in the distance. But around midnight, I heard something different. It was slower, heavier. The sound of footsteps, not the quick, light hops of small animals. These were spaced out, deliberate. I froze in my sleeping bag, every muscle tight. The steps moved in a slow circle around my camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The fire had long gone cold, so the woods were completely black outside. I couldn't see anything. The steps would come, then stop. Then after a pause, I'd hear them again. Closer. My heart pounded so loud I thought whatever was out there would hear it. I gripped my knife in the dark, though I knew it would do little if something large was out there. This went on for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep again. By morning, I was exhausted. I stepped outside the tent and checked the ground. The moss made it hard to see, but in some patches of dirt, I noticed faint impressions. They weren't clear footprints, but the ground looked pressed down, like something heavy had moved through. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer. Maybe it was, but the way it had circled the camp didn't feel right. Animals usually wandered through, not paced around. The day dragged. I tried to fish in a nearby stream, but my hands shook too much. I couldn't stop thinking about the sounds from the night. I considered leaving early, but I didn't want to feel like I had failed. I told myself I would last at least one more night. That evening, I kept the fire burning longer. I sat close, staring into the flames, listening to every sound in the woods. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left the knife beside me again. The footsteps came back. This time, they started earlier, before midnight. Slow, steady, circling. My stomach knotted. I clenched the knife, sweating in the cold night air. The steps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing, heavy, steady, human-like. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whoever or whatever it was stood just feet away, outside the thin fabric of the tent. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, slowly, the steps moved again, fading into the woods. I lay awake until dawn, too terrified to sleep. When the sun came up, I packed. I couldn't stay another night. I told myself it wasn't worth it. This wasn't about testing myself anymore. Something was out there. I broke camp fast, stuffing gear into my pack, barely eating. I started walking back the way I had come, using the compass to guide me. The forest felt different now, heavier, every tree like a watchful figure. Halfway back, I saw something that stopped me cold. On a tree, just above eye level, was a fresh mark. The bark had been cut clean, not by an animal. It looked like a knife slash, sharp and deliberate. I checked other trees around. More marks, some low, some high, a line of them leading deeper into the woods. My mouth went dry. Whoever had been circling my camp wasn't just wandering. They were marking the woods, maybe marking me. I didn't follow the marks. I pushed faster toward the road, my pack bouncing against my back, legs burning. Every sound made me turn, but I never saw anyone. When I finally reached the pull-off, the sight of my car nearly dropped me to my knees. I threw the pack inside, started the engine, and drove without looking back. Even now, I don't know who it was. A hunter? A squatter living deep in the woods? Someone who didn't want me there? I never found out. But I know this, the footsteps were real. The breathing was real. And the marks on the trees were fresh. I haven't camped off-trail since. I had been planning the trip for months before I finally set out. I had spent hours studying maps, searching online for areas where people rarely went, looking for those patches of land that sat far enough away from highways, small towns, and even the occasional dirt roads that hunters like to use. I wanted real quiet. I wanted the kind of silence that pressed down on you until all you could hear was your own heartbeat. I wanted to test myself against that feeling. Maybe it was a foolish thing to want, but I had always been drawn to the woods, and every time I went camping I felt like I never pushed far enough. This time I decided I would go as far as I could, past the areas most hikers or campers would bother with, into the deeper part of the forest where trails faded into nothing and the trees seemed endless. I left early in the morning, my backpack heavy against my shoulders, my boots laced tight, the weight of food, water, and gear pulling me down but also giving me a strange comfort. The sun had barely broken over the horizon, and the air was still cold with that damp smell of earth and leaves that always hits hardest in the early hours. The first several miles weren't bad. The trail was clear, though narrow, and I passed the kind of places where weekend campers would probably set up. Little flat patches with fire rings of old blackened stones, beer cans left behind by someone who didn't care enough to pack them out. I ignored those and kept moving. I wanted to go deeper. As the hours went on, the trail started to thin out. The dirt path grew narrower, the undergrowth crowding in on both sides, branches sometimes hanging low enough that I had to duck under them or push them aside with my forearm. The forest started to feel heavier. The air seemed thicker, more still. By the time noon passed, I was sweating hard and the straps of my pack were digging into my shoulders. The silence out there wasn't complete. There were birds, the occasional snap of a twig from a squirrel, the distant rush of wind high up in the trees, but it felt like a blanket laid over everything, muting the sounds and making me feel cut off from the world. I found a small clearing not long after, and I decided it would be my base. It wasn't perfectly flat, but it was good enough. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and just stood there for a while, looking around at the trees. They rose up on all sides, tall and close together, their branches forming a kind of jagged roof above me, letting streaks of sunlight slip through in broken lines. I felt small standing there, smaller than I usually did in the woods. The trees had that effect on me, like I was a guest in some place I didn't fully belong. I set up camp slowly, taking my time, because part of me didn't want to think about how quiet it already was. I pitched the tent, gathered some wood for a fire, boiled some water for food. I told myself I would stay out here for 3 nights, maybe 4, then head back. I wanted to prove I could do it. Alone, far from anyone, where I had only myself to rely on. The first night passed without much happening. I sat by the small fire, watching the flames lick the edges of the wood, listening to the sounds of insects buzzing, the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. Every time I heard something, I would pause, tilt my head, and wait. Usually it was nothing more than an animal moving, but there was always that moment of tension, that sharp feeling in my chest as I waited to be sure. When I finally crawled into the tent and zipped the door shut, the sound of the nylon brushing against itself seemed too loud, like it would give me away to something watching. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the roof of the tent, before I finally drifted off. The second day, I decided to explore. I left most of my gear at camp and carried only water, a knife, and a small pack with some food. I wanted to see just how far the woods stretched, to get a sense of the land around me. I walked for hours, following no trail, just pushing forward, stepping over roots and ducking under branches. The sound of my boots crunching through leaves the only steady noise. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. There was no sign of people out there. No beer cans, no fire rings, no cut branches. Just forest. At first it felt thrilling, like I had finally found the untouched part one had been looking for. But after a while, it started to feel like something else. The trees seemed closer, the light dimmer even though the sun was still high. The air didn't move. It was like I had stepped into a place that had been waiting for me, a place where no one else ever went. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, a branch snapping, not the kind that falls on its own, but the kind that breaks under weight. I stopped, turned, and looked. Nothing, just the endless line of trees stretching back the way I had come. I stood there for a while, listening so hard that the ringing in my own ears seemed too loud. Then I shook it off and kept moving. But I couldn't stop glancing behind me every few minutes, like my body was preparing me for something my mind didn't want to accept. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low and my legs were tired. I made another small fire, ate, and tried to relax, but that night was worse than the first. Every little sound felt sharper. At one point, in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something brushing against the outside of my tent. Just faint, a dragging sound. I held my breath and stayed still, my hand wrapped around the knife I had kept beside me. The sound stopped after a few seconds, and I stayed awake until the first gray light started to creep through the fabric. I told myself in the morning that it was nothing, probably an animal nosing around. Maybe a raccoon, maybe something bigger like a deer. I tried to believe it. I spent most of that day close to camp, gathering more wood, boiling water, trying to distract myself. But as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were fewer birds. I realized it slowly, but when it hit me, it hit hard. The day before, when I walked out into the woods, I had heard birds calling all the time. Now the air was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, pressing in on me, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. That night was the worst. I barely slept at all. I kept hearing things. Faint cracks, the sound of movement out in the trees. Not close, not right by the tent, but far enough away that I couldn't see what it was if I looked out. I sat by the fire for hours, staring into the dark, my eyes straining to catch any shape between the trees. Once I thought I saw movement, a shadow passing quickly, low to the ground. But when I blinked, it was gone. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I crawled back into the tent. I left the fire burning low, its glow flickering against the fabric. I held my knife tight again, listening. I must have drifted off for a short while, because the next thing I knew I was awake again, heart pounding. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized the fire was out, the glow was gone, and the tent was darker than it should have been. I lay there, frozen, and I swore I heard breathing. Not mine. Not close enough to be inside the tent, but outside, just beyond the thin layer of fabric, slow and steady. I didn't move. I stayed like that until my chest hurt from holding my breath. Finally, after what felt like forever, the breathing faded. I don't know if it actually stopped or if I just couldn't hear it anymore, but I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, I made a decision. I was done. I told myself I had proven enough, that I had gone deep enough into the woods. It wasn't worth it anymore. I packed my things as fast as I could, stuffing gear into my bag with clumsy hands. The woods felt wrong now, dangerous in a way I hadn't expected. The hike back was worse than the hike in. Every sound behind me made me stop and look. Several times I thought I saw something moving, just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned it was gone. My legs felt weak, my mouth dry, my pack heavier than ever. I kept moving, though, one step after another, until I finally started to see signs of the trail again. Faint at first, then clearer. When I finally stepped out of the thick trees and onto a more open path, the relief hit me so hard I almost dropped to my knees. The air felt lighter, the sounds brighter. Birds were calling again. It was like stepping back into the world. I kept moving until I reached the car, threw my pack inside, and sat behind the wheel with my hands shaking against the steering wheel. I never looked back once. Even now, thinking about it, I can't explain everything. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after too much time alone. Maybe it was animals, nothing more. But the way the forest felt out there, the silence, the breathing, the sense of being watched, it was real to me. Real enough that I've never gone that deep into the woods again, and I don't plan to. I started the trip without much thought. I had been working long days, spending too much time behind a desk, and something inside me told me I needed to disappear into the woods for a while. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, small stove, a little food, and a hunting knife I always carried more out of habit than need. The plan was to hike deep into the forest, far enough that I would not hear cars, not see houses, and not run into anyone else. I wanted silence, a real kind of silence, the kind that feels heavy when you're alone. The first hours of the hike were easy. The sun was warm, the air smelled of pine and damp dirt, and the sound of my boots crunching over twigs blended with the calls of birds I didn't recognize. As I pushed deeper, the trail I had been following thinned out. Soon it was gone completely, and I was making my own way, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under branches. That was what I wanted, though. No marked path, no signs, just me and the woods. By late afternoon, I found a small clearing that looked like a good place to set up camp. It was just wide enough to lay down my tent, and the trees closed tightly around it, almost like walls. I boiled some water, ate a simple meal, and stretched out, feeling satisfied. As the light faded, the forest sounds changed. Birds quieted, replaced by the steady buzz of insects. Then that buzzing gave way to the sharper cries of something else deeper in the woods. I told myself it was normal, just animals going about their night, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. The first night passed without trouble, though I woke several times. Once to the snap of a branch nearby, another time to the rustle of leaves. Each time I froze, staring into the darkness, waiting. Nothing ever followed, and eventually, I drifted back into sleep. The second day, I hiked farther, leaving my tent behind to explore. The woods grew denser, darker. I found a creek and followed it for hours, drinking the cold water and feeling like I had stepped out of time. But as the sun lowered, I noticed how easy it was to lose track of where I was. Trees looked the same in every direction. For a moment I panicked, spinning slowly, unsure. Then I spotted a scar in the bark of a tree where I had brushed past earlier, and I followed my trail back. It worked this time, but I realized how quickly I could lose myself out there. That night, things changed. I was lying in my tent, the forest alive outside with night sounds, when I heard something different. It wasn't an animal. It was steady, deliberate. Footsteps, slow, careful steps on the forest floor, moving near my camp. My body stiffened. My breathing became shallow. I lay still, listening, the thin tent wall between me and whatever was outside. The steps circled, not close enough to be right against the tent, but close enough that I could hear leaves shifting, sticks snapping under weight. They went on for minutes, then stopped. I waited, every muscle tight, the silence pressing in. I thought about unzipping the tent and looking out, but something in me refused. I stayed frozen until exhaustion pulled me back into a restless sleep. In the morning, I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a coyote nosing around. But when I stepped outside, I saw the ground. There were prints, not paw prints, boot prints. I crouched down, staring at them. The soil was soft, damp, and the impressions were clear. Someone had been walking around my camp in the middle of the night. My stomach dropped. I was miles from any marked trail, days from the nearest small town. Who else would be out here wandering the dark woods? I thought about packing up right then, but pride and stubbornness held me. I had wanted to escape the world, to test myself. Running back because of a few prints felt weak, so I stayed. All day I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd stop, turn, scan the trees, and always there was nothing. Just trunks, shadows, and patches of sky. But the sensation clung to me like a weight. That night, I built my fire larger than before, the flames snapping high, the smoke curling into the sky. I sat close to it, staring into the dark, every crack of a twig making my chest tighten. The footsteps returned. Later, when the fire had burned low and I had retreated into my tent, I heard them again, this time closer, slow, steady, moving just beyond the reach of the dim glow. They paused, started again, paused. At one point, I swear they stopped only a few feet from me. I lay with my knife gripped in my hand, heart racing so hard I could feel it against the ground beneath me. Hours passed before they faded. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I looked again for prints and found more, mixed with mine, circling. Whoever it was, they had been close enough to touch the tent if they wanted. I made the decision to leave. I packed quickly, strapping everything tight, and started back toward where I thought the road was. But the deeper I went, the more I realized I was turned around. The landmarks I remembered weren't there. The creek I thought I'd find was gone. I walked all day, pushing myself hard, but by dusk, I was still lost. I found another clearing and set camp, though every part of me screamed against it. I ate little, my stomach knotted with fear. When darkness fell, I didn't light a fire. I sat in silence, knife in hand, waiting. The woods grew heavy with night. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, controlled breathing, close enough I could hear the inhale and exhale between the trees. My skin crawled. Whoever was out there was not lost like me. They knew the woods. They were choosing to stay just out of reach. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright, eyes wide, staring at the faint outline of trees against the sky. My ears strained for every sound, every movement. Hours dragged by. At some point, the breathing stopped, but I knew they hadn't gone. They were waiting. The next day, I stumbled forward with no sense of direction. I climbed a ridge, hoping to spot something, but all I saw was more endless forest. My water was running low, my food nearly gone. I rationed what I had left, chewing slowly, drinking sips instead of gulps. My throat stayed dry. By late afternoon, I found another creek. Relief washed through me as I drank, splashing the cold water over my face. But as I knelt there, I saw something upstream. A piece of cloth caught on a branch, torn and dirty. I moved toward it, heart pounding. It was a scrap of a shirt, stained dark. I didn't know if it was old or fresh, but it didn't belong to me. Someone else had been here. Night came again, and with it, the sounds returned. This time, it wasn't just footsteps or breathing. I heard something sharper, a low whistle, just a single note drifting through the trees held too long to be natural. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack and moved through the dark, stumbling, branches clawing at my face and arms. I didn't care about direction anymore. I only cared about putting distance between me and whoever was following. Hours later, I collapsed, chest heaving, body shaking from exhaustion. When dawn came, I realized I had dropped most of my gear in the scramble. My stove was gone, part of my food, even the tent. I was down to the knife, a bottle half full of water, and what I had in my pockets. Panic swelled inside me. I kept walking. Each step felt heavier, my legs burning, my head light from lack of food. But I couldn't stop, not with the thought of someone out there trailing me. By the fourth day, I was weak. My lips were cracked, my stomach cramping with hunger. I moved slow, stopping often to rest. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps closer than ever, behind me. I forced myself forward, breaking into a clumsy run, tripping, catching myself, running again. The forest broke suddenly into a gravel road. I fell to my knees, gasping. Relief surged through me so hard I nearly cried. I looked down the road, one direction swallowed by trees, the other stretching far. I didn't care which way led out. I just ran. Hours later, I stumbled onto a small cabin with a truck parked outside. My body nearly gave out as I reached the door. The man inside was shocked to see me, dirty, shaking, half-starved. He gave me water, food, and let me sit while I tried to explain. When I finally made it back to town, I told myself I'd never go that deep again. I had wanted silence, escape, freedom. Instead, I found something I still can't fully explain. Someone out there in the woods, watching, following, never showing themselves, but never leaving me alone either. The boots in the dirt, the breathing in the dark, the whistle. None of it had been in my head. It was real. And even now, sometimes at night, I wake to the memory of those footsteps circling my tent. I never went back. I never liked the feeling of being watched, but the deeper I went into the woods that afternoon, the more that feeling seemed to cling to me. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, pine sap, and the faint rot of fallen leaves breaking down into the soil. The ground under my boots was uneven, and every step made a crunch or a soft thud depending on whether I landed on old pine needles or patches of dark mud. The light was already dim, though it was only late afternoon. The trees grew so close together in places that their branches twisted into one another, blocking the sky almost completely. I had gone out there to clear my head. It was supposed to be just a hike, nothing special. I had parked my car at a pull-off near an unmarked trail that wasn't really meant for casual walkers. It was one of those paths locals sometimes talked about, where hunters went deeper than they were supposed to, and sometimes people said it just kind of kept going until you didn't know where you were anymore. I brought only a small backpack with a bottle of water, a granola bar, a flashlight, and a folded-up map that didn't even show this part of the woods in much detail. I didn't expect to stay long. The first few hours felt normal. The woods were alive with small sounds. Squirrels rustling in the brush, birds calling, the faint creak of trees swaying. But the deeper I went, the quieter it became. After a while, I realized I couldn't hear any birds at all, just the faint drip of water from somewhere and the sound of my own steps. The silence had a weight to it, like a heavy blanket pressing down. I told myself it was fine. Woods had quiet parts. But then I noticed how faint paths started to appear, almost like trails people had once walked but hadn't been used in years. They were just clearings where the grass didn't grow as high, or where old footprints had hardened the dirt. Some went left, some right, some seemed to snake in strange loops. I followed one that looked like the main way forward, but every 100 yards it seemed to split or curve until I wasn't sure if I was still on the same track. Time passed faster than I realized. When I finally checked my watch, I was surprised at how much daylight I had lost. The forest floor was already dim, and the shadows between the trees looked like walls. I decided to turn back, but when I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, tall, straight trunks, rough bark with deep grooves, dark green tops. I walked faster, thinking I'd find something I recognized. My breathing got heavier, and every time I thought I saw the trail widen or lighten ahead, it only led to more trees. That's when I saw the first thing that really made my stomach tighten. A boot print, fresh, pressed into the soft mud, larger than mine, angled slightly sideways like whoever made it had been in a hurry. I stopped and looked around. There was no sound, no movement, I crouched and touched the print. The edges were still sharp. Whoever left it had been there not long ago. I should have felt relief at the idea of another person nearby, but instead it made the back of my neck prickle. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't like it. The print led deeper into the woods, so without thinking too much, I went the other way. I walked quickly, trying to convince myself I wasn't lost, that I'd find the main trail again. But then I found another print. This one was fainter, older maybe, but close enough to make me realize someone had been moving through the same area. A little farther on, I found more. Some were deep, like the person had been carrying weight. Some seemed angled, as if they'd stopped, turned, and waited. The more I tried to get away from them, the more they seemed to appear. It was as if the woods themselves wanted to keep me on the same path, guiding me along whoever's trail this was. I started sweating, even though the air was cool. My shirt clung to my back, and the straps of my backpack rubbed into my shoulders. I kept walking until I found something else. A small clearing with an old fire pit in the middle. The rocks were blackened, and inside was a pile of charred wood that hadn't been touched in a long time. Around the clearing were a few things scattered. An old canteen, rusted almost completely through. A torn piece of fabric, blue and stiff with dirt. A half-buried metal tin. It looked like someone had camped there years ago, then left in a hurry. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't shake the thought that someone might still be around, watching from between the trees. My eyes darted from trunk to trunk, looking for movement, but I saw nothing. Still, the sense of being followed grew heavier. I kept moving, faster now, almost jogging. Branches whipped against my arms, and the ground dipped and rose unpredictably. My boots slipped on moss, and I nearly fell more than once. The forest grew darker, and I finally pulled out my flashlight, though turning it on made me feel even more exposed. At some point, I smelled something faint in the air. It was sharp, metallic, mixed with the earthy scent of the woods. The more I walked, the stronger it got. Then I saw it. Another clearing, this one smaller, with something lying in the middle. It was a deer, or what was left of one. Its body had been stripped down to bone in places, the ribs showing white and clean. The head was intact, the eyes gone, the jaw hanging open. Flies buzzed in thick clouds around it, and the ground was stained dark beneath. I froze. A predator could have done it, but the cuts on the body didn't look like animal bites. They were clean, almost like slices. My stomach turned, and I stepped back quickly. That was when I heard it. A crack, like a branch breaking, somewhere behind me. I spun with the flashlight, the beam slicing through the trees, but nothing moved. My chest felt tight, and I could barely breathe. I didn't think anymore. I ran. I crashed through the trees, not caring if I was loud, not caring where the trail was. The woods seemed endless, the darkness swallowing me whole. My legs burned, and my throat ached, but I couldn't stop. Eventually, I stumbled onto another path, wider this time. My flashlight shook in my hand as I followed it. I told myself it had to lead somewhere. I kept going until I saw something ahead through the trees. A structure. It was a small cabin, old and weathered, with boards missing from the sides and a roof that sagged. The windows were dark, but smoke curled faintly from a rusted chimney. I stopped dead. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but I was exhausted, lost, and terrified. The cabin was the first sign of people I'd seen. I approached slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. Up close, the cabin looked worse. The wood was soft with rot, and the door hung crooked. There were tools scattered in the dirt outside. An axe, a rusted saw, a bucket with holes in the bottom. The axe handle looked worn from use. Too worn. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. Around the back of the cabin, stacked in a rough pile, were bones. Not animal bones. They were too big, too human-shaped. Some still had scraps of cloth clinging to them, faded and torn. Boots sat near the pile, laces tangled, leather cracked. Couldn't breathe. My whole body went cold. I realized then that the footprints, the old campsite, the deer, it all led here. This was where they ended up. I didn't think. I turned and ran harder than I ever had before. I didn't look back at the cabin, didn't stop when branches cut my arms or when I tripped and tore my knees on the ground. I ran until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. Somehow, by luck or instinct, I broke through the trees and stumbled onto a gravel service road. I collapsed on my hands and knees, gasping, the flashlight rolling out of my grip. For a long moment, I just knelt there, shaking, too scared to move. When I finally stood and looked back, the woods loomed silent and black behind me. Nothing moved, but I knew what was in there. I never went back. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. Not the cabin, not the bones, not the strange trail of prints. I just left that road, found my car hours later, and drove until the woods were far behind me. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that sharp metallic scent, still hear the crunch of footsteps in the dark. And I know, without a doubt, that someone still lives out there in those deep woods, waiting for the next person who wanders too far. I had gone deep into the woods with the plan of staying 3 nights alone, just to push myself and test how far I could go away from comfort. I had done small camping trips before, but never this far into the thick woods, and never by myself. I picked a spot on a map, a large green stretch where no trails ran through, no campsites were listed, and no cabins showed on satellite. I told myself it would be just me, the trees, the ground, and whatever I carried on my back. I packed what I thought was enough: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a water filter, food for a few days, a hatchet, and a knife. The weight of the pack bit into my shoulders as I carried it, but I felt proud knowing I had everything I needed on my back. The hike in took hours. The forest grew thicker with every step, and the further I went, the less sign there was of people. At first, there were faint boot marks in the dirt, maybe from hunters or other hikers, but they disappeared after the first few miles. Then it was only the sound of my boots pressing into the soft ground and the occasional snap of a twig. The trees grew tall, their canopies stretching so high that they blocked much of the sky. The light fell unevenly, with strips of brightness breaking through and landing on the forest floor like fading spotlights. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and sometimes a whiff of rot from somewhere hidden. By the time I picked a spot to set up camp, I was already sweating and tired. I chose a small clearing where the ground was flat and dry, with enough space between the trees to see a short distance around me. I dropped my pack, pulled out the tent, and set it up quickly. The act of hammering stakes into the ground and watching the thin walls rise around me gave me a sense of safety, even though I knew that a thin layer of fabric couldn't keep anything serious out. As the first evening came, the woods grew quiet in a way I hadn't expected. I thought there would be constant noise, birds, crickets, the hum of insects, but it wasn't like that. There were bursts of noise followed by long, heavy silences. Every time it went quiet, I felt my stomach tighten. It was like the trees were holding their breath, waiting. I cooked a small meal on my stove, ate it while sitting on a log, and then crawled into my tent. The forest outside creaked as if the trees shifted in their roots. The first night passed slowly. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. There were noises I couldn't place. Something moving slowly through the leaves, a faint thump far away, the cracking sound of branches under pressure. Each time I heard one, my body went tense and I waited until it stopped. Sleep came only in small stretches, never deep enough. When I woke the next morning, my eyes felt gritty, my body heavy, but I was glad the sunlight had returned. The second day, I wandered further from camp. I didn't want to get lost, so I marked trees with small cuts from my knife as I moved along. The woods stretched endlessly. The ground was uneven, with roots crawling across the dirt and moss covering rocks. I found no sign of people anywhere. Not a single kin, not a footprint, nothing. The silence carried with me as I walked, and I felt like I was the only living person left in the world. I tried to distract myself by gathering wood for the fire and filtering more water, but I could feel the weight of being alone pressing harder. That evening, after I had eaten, I sat by the small fire and let my mind wander. The glow of the flames lit the trunks of the trees around me, and beyond that circle of light was only blackness. It was impossible to see more than a few feet out. I could hear small movements in that darkness. Something stepped lightly, then stopped. Something brushed against the undergrowth. My head turned sharply each time, but nothing showed itself. I convinced myself it was only deer or small animals, but the slowness of the steps didn't fit. They didn't run or scurry. They paced and then paused, like something thinking before taking another step. That night I slept worse. I woke multiple times to the sound of faint crunching nearby. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, low and steady, just outside the tent. I didn't move, didn't even lift my head. I lay stiff, holding my breath, counting in my head to try to block the sound. After what felt like hours, I drifted back into shallow sleep. The third day, I thought about leaving early. My nerves were stretched thin, and the idea of another night in that silence made my stomach twist. But I had planned 3 nights, and something stubborn in me refused to quit early. I spent most of the day close to camp, trying not to wander too far. I found animal tracks in the mud, too large for deer. They looked human at first, the shape similar, but wider and heavier, pressed deep into the soil. I crouched down, staring at them, trying to picture what could have made them. They led off into the brush and vanished. I stood there for a long time, the air around me suddenly colder. That evening, the forest grew louder than usual. Birds called sharply and then fell silent. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, one after another, moving closer. The fire I built seemed too small, too weak against the black woods pressing in. I sat with my back against a log, staring into the dark, trying to catch any movement. I thought I saw something once, a shape shifting between 2 trees, but when I looked harder, it was gone. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. That night was the worst. I zipped myself into the tent early, hoping to shut out the world outside, but it didn't work. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something touching the tent. The fabric pressed inward slightly, like a hand dragging along it. I froze, staring at the bulge as it moved from one side to the other. My throat tightened, my body refusing to move. Then it stopped. I could hear the faint sound of weight pressing into the ground outside, shifting slowly, circling. The breathing came back, heavier this time, like whoever or whatever. It was stood just beyond the thin wall. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every sound sharpening in my head, every shift of the forest filling me with panic. When the light finally returned, I unzipped the tent with shaking hands and stepped out. The ground around the tent was marked with prints. Large, heavy, human-shaped prints pressed into the soil, circling my camp in wide loops. My chest tightened as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the thick brush. I didn't pack slowly that morning. I shoved everything into my bag, broke down the tent as fast as I could, and left the clearing. My body shook as I walked, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. My knife stayed in my hand, gripped so tight that my knuckles ached. The hike out took twice as long because I kept stopping to listen, to check the trees. Every time the forest went silent, I thought it would happen again. That sound of steps following, that breathing just beyond reach. When I finally saw the edge of the woods, when the trees began to thin and the light opened up, I felt my knees weaken with relief. My car was still there, untouched, waiting for me. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I pulled away. I didn't look back. The woods stood behind me, quiet and endless, as if nothing had happened. But the marks on the ground, the sound of breathing in the dark, the slow steps circling my camp, those stayed with me. I knew I had not been alone out there, and I knew I would never go that deep into the woods by myself again. I had never been this far into the woods before. The maps I studied before coming out here showed miles of green with only thin blue lines cutting across, the creeks that fed into a river far to the east. My plan was simple: hike deep, stay a night or two, and come back with the kind of peace I thought I could only find where no one else went. I had camped plenty of times in more popular areas, near marked trails, near other hikers. This time I wanted to see what it felt like to be completely alone. No footsteps in the distance, no voices cutting through the trees, only me and whatever lived out there. The first miles were easy. The ground was soft but firm, covered in pine needles, and the trees were spaced enough that I could keep a straight direction. The air smelled damp and sharp, like moss and wet wood. Sunlight filtered through in slanted rays, hitting the ground in patches that moved as the branches swayed. I kept my pack tight on my back, felt its straps dig into my shoulders. It was heavy with food, water, tent, and all the tools I thought I might need. I told myself I had everything covered. By mid-afternoon, I was far from the last trail marker. I had crossed 2 streams, stepping carefully on slick rocks, and climbed a ridge where the trees grew thinner. From the top, I could see nothing but forest rolling in all directions. It gave me a strange feeling, a mix of freedom and unease. There were no houses, no smoke, no sign of people anywhere. Just endless woods swallowing the land. I kept going down the other side, telling myself I wanted to get far enough that no one would stumble across me even by accident. I found a flat spot near a crooked oak as the light began to fade. The ground there was firm and free of rocks, and a little stream ran a short distance downhill. I set my pack down and began building camp. The motions were automatic. Clearing sticks, laying out the tent, driving the stakes into the dirt. My hands moved steady, but my ears kept picking up sounds behind me. The forest had grown louder as the evening settled in. Birds were shrieking in the distance, bugs buzzing close to my face, branches popping as they bent with the cooling air. Every little snap made me glance over my shoulder. When camp was ready, I sat on a log and ate from a small pack of dried meat and nuts. The food tasted flat, but it filled me. My water bottle was already half empty, so I refilled it from the stream and filtered it with the pump I carried. The water was cold and clean, but I noticed how silent the stream was compared to the forest around it. The trees creaked and the ground clicked with insects, but the water only slid past rocks in a soft hush. Felt like it was holding something back. Darkness came quick. The woods swallowed the light until only the tent glow from my small lantern kept the shadows away. I sat outside for a while, trying to get used to the sounds. Frogs croaked down by the stream. Something heavy moved through the underbrush further off, too large to be a bird. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I had brought, my knuckles stiff, until the noise drifted away. When I finally crawled into the tent, the thin fabric walls didn't feel like protection. They felt like a bright flag that said exactly where I was to anything that wanted to find me. I lay still in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening. My heart didn't slow. Every gust of wind, every rustle, every distant crack, it all stacked on me until I felt sure something was circling camp. I told myself it was only deer, only raccoons. The woods were full of harmless life. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Sometime in the night, I woke with my chest tight. I hadn't heard anything, but something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay there, breathing slow, straining my ears. The woods were quiet now, too quiet. No frogs, no bugs, no movement of branches. Only silence so heavy it pressed against the tent. I reached slowly for my hatchet, keeping the blade close. My eyes followed the thin shadow lines on the fabric as if something might move against them. Nothing did. I don't know how long I lay awake, but eventually exhaustion dragged me down again. Morning light finally broke the weight of that night. The forest looked different in day, brighter, calmer, as if nothing had happened. I stepped out of the tent stiff and sore, stretched, and tried to shake off the unease. The stream was cool on my face when I washed. Breakfast was another handful of dry food, eaten with little thought. I decided to hike further before setting a second camp. My goal had been to go deeper each day, not circle back. I packed up, strapped everything down, and moved on. The woods grew thicker. The trees here were taller, their trunks wide and gray, their roots twisted like claws across the ground. Ferns reached my waist. The sun only broke through in thin lines. Felt older here, untouched, as if no one had walked through in years. I walked for hours, marking the direction with my compass. The forest floor was soft and damp, my boots sinking with each step. Once I found tracks pressed into the mud. They were wide and deep, not fresh but not old either. At first I thought bear, but they looked wrong, longer, like boot prints but stretched. I stood over them for a long time, staring, then forced myself to move on. By late afternoon, I realized I hadn't eaten since morning. I stopped near a hollow log and sat down, unwrapping some food. As I chewed, I noticed something odd. The woods around me were silent again. No birds, no bugs, no sound of wind in the branches. Just silence thick enough that I could hear my own chewing echo in my head. I froze with the food half in my mouth. My ears strained. A faint noise came then, far off, like something dragging across the ground. It stopped when I shifted. I packed quickly and started moving. My chest was tight, every step louder than I wanted it to be. I pushed through ferns, crossed over fallen trunks, followed the compass even though every part of me wanted to turn back. I didn't stop until the light began to fade again. That night, I chose a camp on higher ground. It was a small clearing between thick pines. I built the tent fast, barely clearing the ground, just enough to keep me off roots. I didn't eat. I sat with my back against a tree, gripping the hatchet, staring into the dark. The forest sounds returned, but they didn't calm me. They felt like a cover, as if something moved quieter beneath them. Hours dragged. My eyes burned with tiredness, but I couldn't close them. The wind shifted cold, bringing with it a smell that didn't belong. It was sharp, like rust and wet earth. My stomach turned. I gripped the hatchet tighter and tried to find where it came from, but the dark made every tree the same. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. The dragging sound. Closer now, steady, like weight pulled across dirt. My breath caught in my throat. I crouched low, the tent at my side, the clearing open in front of me. The sound grew, then stopped just beyond the tree line. I waited, every muscle locked. Nothing moved. I couldn't see past the black trunks. After a long stretch, the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sky lightened, I packed with shaking hands and left fast. I didn't even refill my water. My throat burned with thirst, but I couldn't stay there. I needed distance. I walked without rest, pushing hard, ignoring the weight of the pack. My compass kept me east, but the forest twisted around me. I crossed the same creek twice without meaning to. My legs shook from strain. Every so often I thought I heard steps behind me, matching mine, stopping when I stopped. I never turned fully to look. Fear sat heavy in my chest. By late day, I stumbled into a low hollow where the ground turned muddy. The smell hit me first, the same rust and earth stink, but stronger. Flies buzzed thick in the air. At the center of the hollow lay the remains of a deer. Its ribs were torn wide, the hide hanging loose, the skull caved in. The body wasn't fresh, but it hadn't been eaten clean either. It looked torn apart and left. I gagged, covered my mouth, stumbled back. That was when I saw it. A shape between trees on the far side, too still to be wind. Human size, but the shoulders hunched, the arms long. It didn't move, didn't shift, just stood half hidden in shadow. My chest froze. I couldn't see its face, only the pale line of what could have been skin. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my arms, roots caught my boots, but I didn't stop. I crashed through the woods with the pack slamming my back, lungs burning. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to move. Behind me, the forest snapped and cracked, heavier than any deer. Night fell while I ran. My legs gave out on a ridge, and I collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, sweat cold on my skin. I listened, ears wide, but heard nothing now. Only the forest settling again, insects buzzing weakly, wind pushing the tops of trees. I knew then I couldn't keep going deeper. If I didn't find my way back, I would. I had been planning a trip into the woods for months, something different from the usual short hikes and small overnight stays near campgrounds. I wanted to go deeper this time, into the kind of woods that stretched far past where most people dared to go, a place where the trails turned faint and the silence grew heavy. I wanted to push myself further, test my limits, and see what it felt like to be completely alone with nothing but the trees, the dirt, and the dark. I picked a stretch of forest land that didn't have marked camping areas. It was just vast green wilderness, dotted with streams, broken ridges, and endless trees. I didn't plan to go more than 3 nights, but I wanted to go far enough that I couldn't hear a car, see a road, or catch a cell signal. I parked my truck near the end of a logging road, loaded my backpack, and started walking deeper with no one else around. The air was cool, a damp smell of pine and wet soil carrying through the trees. The ground was soft under my boots, still holding the weight of rains from a few days earlier. The first miles were easy, a wide trail used by hunters and loggers, but after about 2 hours it narrowed and then disappeared into nothing but animal paths and undergrowth. That was exactly what I wanted. The deeper I went, the more I felt the outside world slipping away. The silence grew thicker, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of something moving unseen through the brush. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot near a bend in a small stream. It was a good place to set up camp for the first night. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and set up my small tent. The forest was dense here, tall pines and oaks overhead, their branches knitting together to block most of the sun. Even during the day, it felt darker than it should. I gathered wood, made a small fire, and sat quietly, listening to the way the stream gurgled beside me. The first night passed without much trouble. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin fabric of the tent ceiling, hearing only the wind move through the trees. I thought it was going to be peaceful, maybe even easy. The next morning, I packed up and pushed further. I wanted to make the second night the deepest point, the place where I'd feel as far from everything as possible. The terrain grew rougher as I climbed a ridge and dropped down into a hollow thick with brush. It was harder to move quietly here, branches snagging at my clothes, thorns scratching against my hands. I found myself sweating, the weight of the pack digging into my back. By noon, I stumbled into a small clearing, probably made by a tree fall years earlier. Sunlight cut through the gap and warmed my face. I sat there for a while, drinking water, eating some dried food, and checking my map, though I was mostly going by compass and instinct at this point. I pushed on until I found another stream, wider this time, its banks lined with mossy rocks. It was quieter here, the kind of silence where every sound carried sharp and clear. I felt the change immediately, like I had stepped into some pocket of stillness that didn't want to be disturbed. I set up my second camp there, near the water, and built a fire from dry wood I found under a leaning tree. As the fire cracked, I felt the sense of isolation grow heavier. There was no hum of traffic, no planes overhead, not even the faint sound of distant people. Just me and the firelight flickering against the trunks around me. That night things changed. I lay in my tent, half asleep, when I heard something move outside. It wasn't the usual snap of a twig or the scurry of a small animal. It was heavier, slower, deliberate. I froze, my ears straining. The sound circled my camp, moving one way, stopping, then picking up again on the other side. I held my breath, telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe a bear passing through. But it didn't move on. It lingered, almost like it was studying my camp, the sound of weight pressing into the ground, shifting from one side to another. I clutched my knife in the dark, my heart thudding, but I didn't move. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded into the woods. I lay awake for hours after, listening to every creak and sigh of the forest, waiting for it to come back. When daylight came, everything looked normal again. The fire pit was cold, the stream glistened in the morning light, and nothing looked disturbed. I told myself I was being paranoid, that in deep woods everything felt bigger and stranger at night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone. Still, I packed up and pressed further. The plan was to spend one more night deep in and then start back out on the fourth day. I told myself I'd make the third camp somewhere safer, maybe higher ground where I could see more around me. The hike that day was harder. The ridge ahead was steeper than it looked on the map, and the brush thickened as I climbed. My legs ached, and sweat ran down my back. I stopped often to drink and rest, but the forest seemed to grow denser, quieter. The silence pressed in, broken now and then by the distant crack of something moving far off. I couldn't tell if it was animal or not. By late afternoon, I found a narrow ledge halfway up the ridge that overlooked a shallow valley. Seemed like a good spot. I could see the slope below, and the valley stretched out into endless trees. I set up camp there, built a fire, and cooked a small meal. As the light faded, I felt the unease from the night before creeping back. The woods felt like they were watching me, every rustle making me turn my head. That night, the sounds returned. At first, it was far off, faint movements in the brush, but soon it grew closer. Something stepped heavily, paused, then stepped again. The sound circled slowly, moving uphill and downhill, never straying too far. My fire burned low, shadows twisting across the trees. I gripped my knife tighter, my throat dry. Hours dragged on with the steps coming and going, always just outside the firelight. At one point, I swore I heard breathing, low and heavy, but when I strained to listen, it was gone. Sleep never came. I sat upright in my tent, wide-eyed, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but the waiting itself was worse than anything else. When dawn finally came, I was shaking, exhausted, but still alive. I decided I'd had enough. 3 nights was my limit, and I didn't care if I cut it short. I packed up quickly, too nervous to even eat, and started down the ridge. I wanted out. The woods didn't feel like adventure anymore. They felt hostile, heavy with something I couldn't name. Every step I took felt watched. My nerves stretched thin, jumping at every sound. Branches snapped somewhere behind me more than once, but every time I stopped and looked, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was deer moving through, or maybe just the echo of my own footsteps bouncing strangely in the woods. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The descent grew harder. I lost the faint paths I had followed in and had to push through thick undergrowth. My legs burned, and the weight of the pack seemed heavier than before. Sweat soaked my shirt, my hands trembling with every grip on a branch to steady myself. Hours passed, and I wasn't even sure I was going the right way. My compass said yes, but the land didn't look the same. At one point, I stumbled into a patch of ground where the soil was torn up, gouges ripped into the earth like something had clawed through it. The prints were wide, deep, and too erratic to be from a single animal. I didn't linger. I just pushed on, faster now, stumbling, nearly running at times. The sounds followed, not close enough to see, but always there. Branches cracking, faint weight pressing into leaves, the occasional snap of something too large to be a rabbit or squirrel. I knew then it wasn't just my imagination. Something had been tracking me since that second night. Something was keeping pace, waiting. By the time the sun dipped low, I was still nowhere near where I'd started. My map made less sense with every glance. I realized I would have to spend a 4th night out here whether I wanted to or not. I forced myself to set up camp on a narrow strip of flat ground near a fallen tree. I built no fire. I sat in the dark, back against the trunk, knife in hand, my pack tight against me. The forest around me was silent at first, and then it began again. Slow, heavy steps moving through the brush, stopping, waiting, starting again. They came closer this time, closer than before. My chest tightened as I gripped the knife, my eyes darting into the black. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, each breath shaking in my chest. The steps circled, pausing, then continuing, almost like it was testing me. I stayed awake all night, never moving, never blinking long enough to lose focus. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just waited in the black. The steps didn't stop until near dawn, fading away like they had before. When daylight came, I was already moving. I didn't even pack my tent. I just left it, cutting weight, needing speed more than anything. I moved without stopping, my legs aching, feet blistered, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I checked the compass every few minutes, forcing myself in a straight line west, hoping I would hit the logging road again. I had been planning that trip for weeks, marking maps, double-checking my gear, and reading about the trails. I had gone camping before, but never so deep into the woods, never into a place where you could walk for hours and still not see a single road or house. That was what I wanted though, real isolation. No people, no sounds of traffic, no cell signal, just me and the quiet of the forest. Felt like an escape from everything. I packed enough food for days, a small tent, a sleeping bag, water filters, a hunting knife, and a headlamp with extra batteries. I even carried a small notebook to keep track of my route in case something went wrong. I thought I had prepared for everything. The morning I left was calm and clear. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky had no clouds at all. I drove my truck to a dirt road near the trailhead and left it parked at the very end. There weren't any other cars, which made me feel like I had the whole forest to myself. I tightened the straps on my backpack and started walking. At first the path was wide, with signs nailed to trees marking directions. But after the first hour the markers stopped, and the trail narrowed into a winding path covered in roots and fallen leaves. The trees stood close together, tall and heavy with branches that blocked much of the sunlight. It already felt different from any hike I had done before. I kept a steady pace, trying not to stop too often so I could get far into the woods before setting up camp. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sound of cars, no distant planes overhead, not even the buzzing of power lines. Only the steady rhythm of my boots on dirt, the occasional crack of twigs underfoot, and the faint sound of wind sliding through the treetops. Once in a while, I would hear a bird call or the rush of a squirrel through the leaves, but other than that, it was silence. It felt like stepping into another world, one that existed long before people came around. Hours passed like that. I drank from my water bottle and ate a protein bar while leaning against a fallen log. I checked my map and compass, marking where I thought I was, though it was already harder than I expected to keep track. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and the landscape repeated itself with the same ridges, valleys, and streams. The sun moved overhead, shifting light through the branches in slow patches. By mid-afternoon, I decided it was time to find a spot to camp. I came across a small clearing surrounded by pines. The ground was flat, and there was a trickling stream only a short walk away. It seemed perfect. I set down my pack, cleared away branches, and pitched the tent. It always took longer than I thought, but eventually the poles were up, and the tent stood steady. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside, stacked my food higher up in a tree with rope to keep animals away, and collected enough firewood for the evening. When the fire finally caught, the sun had already dipped low. The orange glow pushed shadows back, and the smell of smoke filled the clearing. I sat close, eating from a small pan I carried, and the warmth of the flames made me feel comfortable after the long hike. For a while, it was almost peaceful. The forest around me was still, with only the faint crackle of the fire and the occasional drip of water from leaves. I wrote a few notes in my notebook, mostly about the trail and the camp, and then stretched out by the fire. It wasn't until the night grew deeper that the first unease settled in. Out in the dark, past the edge of the firelight, the woods felt alive in a way that was different from the daytime. Every sound seemed louder, sharper, and harder to place. A rustle of branches somewhere far away, then silence. The faint snap of a twig. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons, just normal animals moving at night, but my body stayed tense. I could feel the weight of the dark pressing close, the trees crowding in around the little circle of firelight. I eventually crawled into the tent, zipped the flap, and lay in my sleeping bag. The fire outside still burned, but dimmer now. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but sleep was thin and broken. Every little noise outside kept pulling me awake. A scrape against bark, a crunch of leaves, the sound of something shifting its weight slowly, like steps being placed carefully. I held my breath and listened hard, but each time the sounds would stop. I told myself it was all in my head, just the woods playing tricks, but it didn't feel like tricks. At some point I drifted into a shallow sleep, but when I woke again the fire had died, and the clearing was pitch black. I checked my watch by the faint glow of its numbers. It was almost 3 in the morning. My throat felt dry, so I reached for the water bottle inside the tent. That was when I heard it, closer this time. A sharp crack, like weight pressing down on a branch until it snapped. Not far from the tent. My heart began to race. I held still, straining my ears. Another sound followed, softer but heavy. The shift of something moving on 2 legs, not 4. I froze completely, every nerve locked. The sound of slow, careful steps circled the edge of the clearing. They weren't rushed. They weren't wandering. They moved in a pattern, deliberate and steady, crunching leaves and pressing the earth in a rhythm that told me whatever it wasn't an animal. I lay flat, barely breathing, my hand gripping the knife I kept beside me. The steps stopped for a long moment, then I heard the faint brush of fabric against bark, like someone leaning against a tree, watching. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually the sounds faded, swallowed by the silence of the woods. My muscles ached from holding still, but I didn't dare move until the first faint gray light of dawn touched the edges of the clearing. When I finally unzipped the tent, the forest looked calm again, almost too normal. But I saw impressions in the soft dirt near the trees. Not hooves, not paws. Shoes, large ones, pressed deep into the soil, circling where I had camped. My stomach tightened. There was no reason anyone should be out there. This part of the forest wasn't a known camping spot. There were no cabins, no roads, no trails nearby except the one I had left behind hours back. Whoever it was hadn't approached me openly, hadn't called out or made themselves known. They had just walked around my camp in the dark, slow and quiet, like they wanted me to know but not see them. I packed up quickly that morning. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but my nerves wouldn't calm. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and that spot. I followed my compass south, trying to keep on track, but the forest made it difficult. Everything looked the same. I crossed streams, climbed ridges, and marked trees with my knife so I wouldn't loop back by mistake. All the while, I felt watched. I would stop, look around, and catch nothing but still trees, yet the feeling clung to me, heavy and pressing. Hours later, I stopped by another clearing to eat. That was when I noticed it on the ground, near the far edge of the clearing, a single print in the dirt, fresh, larger than mine, pointed in the same direction I had just come from, like someone had been following behind me. I pushed on faster after that, barely resting, drinking water as I walked. The woods grew thicker, and by late afternoon I realized I wasn't where I thought I was anymore. The compass still pointed south, but the terrain had pulled me into valleys and around slopes that didn't match the map. I tried to trace back, but it was useless. The trails had disappeared, replaced with endless trees and uneven ground. I wasn't lost completely, but I was off my route, and it was getting late again. I set camp before dark, in a spot hidden under heavy branches. I didn't build a fire this time. I ate cold food and sat in silence, barely moving. The forest around me was black, the air damp and heavy. I stayed awake as long as I could, clutching the knife and staring at the shadows, but exhaustion won. My eyes closed, and I drifted into broken sleep. I woke to the faintest sound, fabric brushing fabric, like clothing moving against itself. My heart pounded instantly. The noise was right outside the tent, slow, steady. Then a soft crunch of leaves. Whoever it was had found me again. I held my breath, hand on the knife, my entire body shaking with adrenaline. I thought about unzipping the tent and bursting out, but fear locked me down. The sound circled again, the same way as before, slow steps tracing the edge of the camp. After what felt like forever, it faded into the distance. When daylight came, I crawled out and checked. The prints were there again, circling the camp, pressed deep into the soil. This time I noticed something else. A small piece of torn fabric caught on a branch nearby. Dark, almost black, not from my clothing. My body felt like it was running on empty, but fear kept me moving. I needed to get back to the truck, no matter what. I set my compass and pushed south again, harder this time. My legs burned, and my pack felt heavier with every mile, but I didn't stop. The whole way I felt it, always just behind me, never close enough to see, but always there. By late afternoon, I had been wanting to get away from everything for a while, away from traffic, phones, and people. The deep woods always had a pull on me. It wasn't the calmness alone. It was the test of being by myself, far from help, where every sound carried a weight. I had planned a long weekend trip into a stretch of forest I had only driven past before. It was thick, uneven, and not touched much by people. It was the kind of place where you could walk for hours and not find a single trail marker. That's what made me pick it. I started the trip early in the morning, the back of my car loaded with gear. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and enough food and water to last me several days. I had maps printed out, a compass, and a knife I always carried when camping. The drive to the forest edge took most of the morning. By the time I parked on a dirt pull-off and started carrying my gear down into the trees, the sun was already hot, and the forest floor looked alive with shadows. The first hour of walking felt normal. I followed what looked like an old path at first, maybe from hunters or loggers, but it faded quick. After that, it was just me picking my way between tree trunks and tall brush. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The sound of cars was long gone, and all that remained was the occasional call of a bird, the snap of a twig under my boots, and the steady sound of my own breathing. By mid-afternoon, I found a flat patch of ground near a shallow stream. It looked good enough for a camp. I dropped my pack and set up the tent. I collected some branches for a small fire later and filtered some water from the stream. The air smelled damp, like moss and wet leaves. The place looked untouched. For a while, I just sat and listened. That's what I loved most about the woods, being so far from people that even the sound of the wind felt louder. But the longer I sat there, the more I noticed that the quiet wasn't steady. It was broken, like the forest held its breath sometimes. I'd hear the birds, and then suddenly nothing. Total silence. The kind that makes you feel like something is moving that you can't see. That night, I cooked a small meal and sat by the fire. The trees around me seemed to stretch taller in the dark. My fire was small, barely lighting more than a few feet in front of me, and beyond that it was just black. I kept listening to the woods, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant crack of something stepping on branches. I told myself it was deer. Out here it had to be deer or maybe raccoons nosing around. Still, I kept my knife within reach when I finally crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake to some faint noise. Once it was a scrape near the tent. Another time it was something heavy moving through the brush. I lay there holding my breath, gripping the knife handle in the dark. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't rested at all. I thought about packing up and heading back, but pride pushed me further. I wanted to prove to myself I could stay out here, deep in the woods with no one else around. So I decided to move camp, go deeper, see if I could find a ridge or clearing with a better view. I hiked for hours that day. The land dipped and rose, full of deadfall and thick undergrowth. I cut through thickets, crossed small streams, and climbed slopes covered in loose soil. The deeper I went, the more I realized how far I was getting from the car. The forest felt endless. By late afternoon, I came across a clearing with tall grass and a cluster of big rocks. It looked like a decent spot. I dropped my pack and set up again. But as I worked, I noticed something strange. The ground around the clearing had signs of use. The grass was trampled in places, not by animals but by boots. There were old fire pits, long cold, with blackened stones in a circle. Someone had been here before and not that long ago. That unsettled me. It wasn't unusual for others to use the woods, hunters or campers, but the fact that the fire pits looked fresh meant someone might still be nearby. I scanned the trees around me, but there was nothing, just the shifting shadows. That night was worse than the first. I barely ate, too uneasy to enjoy the food. I kept the fire higher than usual, needing the light. As the dark pressed in, I kept hearing noises again. This time, it wasn't just one or two. It was steady, the sound of branches snapping, faint footsteps circling just out of sight. My skin crawled. I told myself it could be animals again, but the rhythm of it felt wrong. Too steady, too much like someone walking and stopping, walking and stopping. When I finally forced myself to lie down, I left the fire burning low outside the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. In the middle of the night, I woke with my heart racing. The fire had burned to embers, and I heard it breathing. Not mine, not an animal. Slow, steady breathing right outside the tent wall. My hand closed on the knife so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't move. I just listened, every muscle in my body locked. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever, and then, slowly, it faded. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent with shaking hands. The clearing was empty, but in the soft dirt near the fire pit, I saw it. A footprint, not mine, barefoot. The print was clear, pressed deep, the toes spread out in the soil. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been out there wasn't wearing shoes. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up quick and decided to head back the way I came. But the woods can twist you around. Paths look different in daylight. I walked for hours and still didn't find the stream I thought would lead me back. The deeper I went, the more lost I felt. As the day dragged on, I realized I was in trouble. My map was useless without a clear marker. The trees stretched the same in every direction. I stopped at another patch of ground and built a quick shelter, too tired to set the tent up again. I kept a fire going, feeding it with every branch I could find. That night, the noises came back, louder now, more footsteps in the brush, circling. I thought I saw movement in the firelight, just quick shapes between the trees. I didn't know how many, but it felt like more than one. I stayed up all night gripping the knife, staring into the dark, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was worn down. My water was running low, and my food was half gone. I tried moving again, pushing through the woods, but it felt useless. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in. I kept catching whiffs of smoke, faint, like someone else had a fire not far away. But when I stopped to listen, the woods went dead quiet. That afternoon, I found something that froze me in place. A tree, its bark carved with deep cuts, lines crossing into shapes. Not words, just marks, but deliberate. Around the base of the tree were bones. Small animal bones, scattered like they'd been cracked open. Some were fresh, with bits of fur still clinging. My stomach turned. I didn't stay near that tree. I moved fast, tripping over roots, my nerves raw. As night fell, I picked another spot and made a small fire, barely enough to see by. I was scared the smoke would draw whoever had left those prints, but I was more scared of the dark. That night, I heard them again, this time closer. I thought I saw the outline of a figure between the trees, standing still, watching. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. My whole body felt cold. When I blinked, the figure was gone, but I knew it hadn't been my imagination. By the next morning, I made up my mind. I had to get out, even if it meant walking blind. I picked a direction and didn't stop. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my head spun from exhaustion, but I kept going. I followed the slope downhill, hoping it would lead to water and maybe a road or a house. Hours later, I stumbled onto a logging road. It was overgrown, but it was something. I followed it until I saw tire tracks, fresh in the dirt. Relief washed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. I kept walking and finally, I saw a truck parked on the side. I didn't care whose it was. I went straight to it and waited. Eventually, the owner came back, a man in work clothes carrying tools. He looked at me like I was half dead, which I probably did. I didn't explain much, just asked where the nearest town was. He gave me a ride and I never looked back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I wasn't alone. The footprints, the bones, the circling steps in the night, they were real. I left that forest behind, but even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can hear it again. That slow breathing just outside the tent, waiting in the dark. I had always thought that going deep into the woods by myself would give me peace. I had gone camping many times before, usually in areas where the trails were marked, and you would see the occasional hiker or someone fishing by a stream. But that summer, I wanted something different. I wanted to go far away from people, away from noise, away from anything that made me feel like I wasn't really cut off. I wanted to test myself, to see how I would feel in the kind of silence that only comes when you walk far past where most people would ever bother going. I packed everything carefully: food for days, a tent, my knife, a hatchet, my sleeping bag, and some gear I had never had to use before, like water purifying tablets and a compass. I checked the weather. It was clear. I told myself this was perfect. The first day of hiking was tiring but normal. The trail I followed in the beginning slowly turned into something less clear, and eventually, I was stepping over fallen branches, moving through brush, and having to check the compass often. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing by a cluster of tall pines, and I decided to make that my camp for the night. I set up my tent, gathered wood, and lit a small fire. The woods felt quiet, but in a good way. The only sounds were insects, the occasional distant bird, and the wind shifting through the trees. I ate a simple meal, drank some water, and sat watching the fire until the sky darkened and the stars came out. I slept easily that night, telling myself this was what I had wanted. The second day, I hiked even further in. The trees grew denser, and the ground uneven. I had to move slower, and sometimes I stopped just to get my bearings. I didn't see a single person or even any signs of people. It gave me the strange feeling that I was walking into a place where nobody had been in a long time. Around noon, I came across a narrow stream with clear water running over smooth stones. I filled my bottle, used the tablets, and sat for a while to rest. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. Everything looked untouched, perfect even. But as the sun started to sink and I began looking for another place to set camp, I noticed something that unsettled me. About 50 yards off, deeper in the woods, I thought I saw a shape between the trees. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a tree trunk at an odd angle or a shadow, but I kept glancing that way and feeling like it wasn't the same as the rest of the woods. It looked darker, more upright, almost like a person standing still. I stared hard, but the more I focused, the more it blended in, until I wasn't sure anymore. I laughed a little under my breath, thinking I was tired, and kept walking. I found a flat patch near some thick bushes and made camp there. Still, as I gathered wood for the fire, I kept glancing back into the trees, half expecting to see that shape again. I never did, and eventually I sat by the fire, telling myself it was just the woods playing tricks. That night, though, as I lay in my tent, I had trouble falling asleep. I could hear the usual forest sounds, the crickets and the faint breeze, but every once in a while I thought I heard something else. Not footsteps exactly, but like a faint rustle of brush being disturbed, slow, deliberate. I kept sitting up, listening, holding my breath, and then hearing nothing at all. Hours passed like that, me drifting off for a moment, then snapping awake. By morning, I was exhausted, but nothing seemed out of place. The third day, I hiked even deeper. The woods grew darker as the trees seemed taller and closer together. Sunlight filtered through in small patches. I had to push through branches that scratched at my arms and face. The ground was damp in places and smelled like old leaves. I was sweating, moving slower than before, and for the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far. I tried to push that thought away, telling myself this was the adventure I wanted. Around late afternoon, I found another clearing and set up camp. As the light faded, I gathered wood again, but this time I noticed something that stopped me cold. Just outside the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, there was a tree with deep scratches running down its trunk. They weren't small like from an animal climbing. They were long, deep, and straight, as if something had dragged something sharp down it over and over. The bark was stripped and curled at the edges. I ran my fingers over it and felt how rough and splintered it was. It didn't look old either. It looked fresh. My stomach tightened. I told myself it must have been a bear, though the marks looked strange, too clean, too evenly spaced. I backed away, went to the fire, and sat staring at the shadows that crept at the edges of the clearing. That night was worse. I lay in my tent, and at first, everything was silent. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, clearer this time, A sound of steps, slow and heavy, moving somewhere out in the dark. My whole body froze. I held my breath and listened, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The steps would come, pause, then come again, circling. They weren't close enough to be at the edge of my camp, but they were close enough that I knew something was moving out there, and it was large. I gripped my knife tight, not knowing what else to do. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I stumbled out, half expecting to see prints in the soil, but the ground was covered in leaves, and I couldn't make anything out. I told myself I would hike back, but as I tried to retrace my way, I realized how easy it was to get turned around in those woods. The trees all looked the same, and the ground twisted and rose in ways that confused me. I kept checking the compass, moving slow, but every step felt like I was sinking deeper. By late afternoon, I gave up and made camp again, promising myself tomorrow I would start earlier and make real progress back. That evening, as I was sitting by the fire, I heard another sound. Not footsteps this time, but a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. It came from the same side as the scratches I had seen. I stared into the trees, my firelight not reaching far enough to show anything. My skin prickled. I forced myself to sit still, not to move, not to show anything. Hours went by like that. When I finally crawled into the tent, I kept the knife in my hand, the hatchet by my side. I lay awake for what felt like forever, and then I heard it again. Steps, slow, heavy, this time closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the faint shifting of brush, then silence, then a sudden sound, like something dragging against the ground. My chest tightened so hard I thought I would stop breathing. I waited, my muscles locked, my ears straining, then nothing. Just silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat echo inside my skull. When morning came, I stepped out shaking. Around the edges of the clearing, in the dirt between the leaves, I finally saw them. Prints. Large, heavy prints. Not boots, not shoes. Bare. Human. The sight made my stomach twist. They circled the camp, moving in uneven lines, coming close to my tent, then backing away. Some pressed deep into the ground as if whoever made them had been standing still for a long time. I stood staring at them for a long time, my throat dry, my hands shaking. I knew now it wasn't an animal. Someone was out there watching me walking barefoot through the deep woods. I packed up fast, my hands fumbling. I tried to follow the compass, pushing hard to make progress, but every noise made me stop and look over my shoulder. Sometimes I thought I saw movement behind the trees, just a flicker, a shadow shifting. Sometimes I smelled smoke, faint, like someone had lit a fire far away, but I could never see it. That day I hiked until my legs were trembling, until blisters burned on my feet. By evening I found a rocky slope and made camp against it, hoping the wall of stone would shield me on one side. I built a smaller fire this time, keeping it low, trying not to draw attention. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the trees, waiting. My nerves were so tight I jumped at every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig. I thought of those barefoot prints circling my camp and tried not to imagine who they belonged to. That night, I didn't go in the tent. I sat against the rock with the fire in front of me, gripping the hatchet, forcing myself to stay awake. And sometime deep in the night, I heard it again. Steps, closer than before. My skin turned cold. I held my breath, staring into the dark. Then I saw it. Not fully, not clear, but enough. A figure standing between the trees. Tall, unmoving, watching. I blinked, and it was gone, slipping back into the shadows like it had never been there. I didn't move until morning. When the light finally broke, I packed what I could and started walking again. My food was running low, and every direction felt wrong. I told myself if I kept going straight, I would hit something, a road, a trail, anything. But all I found were more trees, more silence. By the 5th day, I was weak, hungry, and so tired I could barely think straight. I stumbled through the woods like in a daze, my mind filled with the image of that figure standing in the dark. That afternoon, I saw smoke in the distance. I had always liked going into the woods alone. It felt quiet, far away from everything, and for some reason, I thought it cleared my head better than anything else. That year, I decided I would go deeper into the woods than I had ever been before. I looked at a map before I left and saw a wide patch of forest with no roads, no cabins, nothing marked for miles. It felt like the right place to test myself. I packed light, enough food for 3 days, a small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I thought I was prepared. The air was warm when I started out, the sun bright through the trees. The trail was easy at first, then it narrowed until there was no trail at all. I followed an old logging road that had long been taken back by weeds and bushes. It felt exciting, stepping where most people never went. The deeper I walked, the more quiet everything got. Even birds seemed less common out there, just the occasional flap of wings or a crow somewhere far off. By the time the sun started dipping, I found a small flat patch of ground between some thick pines and set up camp. I cooked a small meal on my little stove, sat listening to the sound of branches creaking overhead, and felt satisfied. I thought the silence would bother me, but instead, it felt almost heavy, like the forest itself was pressing in. When I lay down in my sleeping bag, the stillness made every sound sharp. A twig snapping in the distance felt louder than it should. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, normal animals moving through the brush. I eventually fell asleep. The second day, I pushed further. I wanted to see how far I could go without seeing a single sign of people. I walked slow and careful, looking at trees that were so tall they seemed endless. Some were scarred with claw marks. That made me pause. They were high up, too, not the kind of scratches a small animal would make. I ran my fingers over them and then moved on quickly, telling myself bears were normal here, and they usually wanted nothing to do with people. Still, I kept my knife closer at hand. The ground grew rougher as I moved deeper. Roots curled out like ropes across the soil, and gullies cut through the land where water had carved channels long ago. The forest smelled stronger too, a mix of damp moss and the sharp bite of pine. Every step I took felt like it carried me further away from the world I knew. That night, I set up camp near a fallen log. I didn't build a fire because I didn't want to draw attention, though I wasn't sure from what. I just felt it was safer. I ate cold food, drank from my filtered water, and laid down again. That night, the noises were different. Instead of random snaps and cracks, I kept hearing steady movement. It wasn't close, but it circled far off. It would start in one direction, fade, then appear again on the opposite side. The sound of leaves brushing, twigs breaking lightly, always in pairs or triples, never a single crack. My body stayed tense for hours. I gripped my flashlight, waiting, ears straining, my heart loud in my chest. Sometime deep in the night, I finally dozed off, but it wasn't real sleep. Every time I drifted, I'd jolt awake again, sure something was standing nearby. When dawn came, I felt heavy and drained, but relief pushed me forward. I packed up fast and moved. The deeper I went that day, the more uneasy I felt. There were no bird calls now, no sound of insects buzzing, nothing except the wind shifting through the trees. Even that felt muted, like the air itself was thicker. I found prints in the dirt once, larger than my hand, wide and heavy. They weren't fresh, but they made me pause for a long time. They went in the same direction I was heading. My throat felt dry, and I almost turned back then, but I told myself I'd come too far to quit. That afternoon, clouds began rolling in. The forest darkened, and a chill settled in. The trees swayed hard, and dead branches fell now and then, crashing down. I hurried to set up shelter before the storm hit. I tied my tent to low roots and weighted it with rocks so the wind wouldn't tear it apart. The storm came hard, sheets of rain hammering down, the sound echoing through the trees like distant drums. Water pooled quickly, soaking the ground beneath me. I sat curled up inside, listening to the storm drown out every other noise. But then, through the storm, I heard something else. A steady sound, heavy and dull, like footsteps. At first I thought I imagined it. Rain can make strange rhythms, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. A crunch, pause, then another crunch. Slow, deliberate, not rushed. I froze, holding my breath. The steps drew closer, then stopped just outside my tent. I sat there, knife in hand, the sound of rain pounding all around me, heart racing so loud I thought it would give me away. I didn't move. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but rain and silence. Then, slowly, the steps started again, circling, fading into the storm. I stayed awake the whole night, gripping my knife, my legs shaking from the tension. When morning came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Mud covered everything, and my tracks from the day before had been washed away. But there were new prints in the mud. Large, heavy, pressed deep. They circled the tent in a wide loop before heading back into the woods. I couldn't stay. I packed fast and decided I would turn back the way I came. But that was when I realized I didn't know which way that was anymore. The storm had taken all signs of my trail. Every direction looked the same. I tried to use the sun, but the sky was still thick with clouds. I picked a direction and walked, but the forest only grew denser. Hours passed, and I saw nothing I recognized. My food was running low, my legs heavy, and fear pressed harder into me with every step. The silence was unbearable. Then I noticed it again, the sound of steps, faint but steady, always behind me, never rushing, never close enough to see. By evening, I found a clearing with a fallen tree and set up my tent. Though my hands shook as I worked, I barely ate. That night, the sound returned. Not just steps now, but the faint crack of branches bending, the shuffle of something large shifting its weight. It circled wider this time, sometimes close enough that I swore I felt the ground tremble faintly beneath me. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I ran. I didn't even pack my tent. I just left it there and ran with my pack bouncing on my shoulders. My breath burned in my chest. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I wanted out of the woods more than anything I'd ever wanted in my life. I didn't care about food or direction anymore. I just kept moving. The forest seemed endless. No matter how far I went, it never changed. At times I thought I was moving in circles, passing the same twisted trees, the same gullies, the same moss-covered logs. My throat was dry, and my stomach cramped. I stopped only to drink from streams, never longer than a few minutes. The steps were always there, steady, patient, never tired. By the fourth day, I was broken. My feet were torn from the rough ground, my clothes soaked and filthy. I could barely lift my pack anymore. My body screamed to stop, but I couldn't bring myself to. I knew if I stopped, I would hear those steps come closer, and I wouldn't be able to get up again. Finally, near dusk, I saw something ahead. At first, I thought it was another trick of the woods, but as I got closer, I saw it was a thin dirt road. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I stumbled onto it, dragging myself forward, and after another half-mile, I saw a parked truck. No one was around, but I didn't care. I collapsed near it, my chest heaving, my body shaking. I stayed there until morning, too afraid to move. Nothing followed me onto the road. The woods stayed still, as if whatever had been there refused to step beyond the trees. When daylight came, a ranger found me. My story spilled out in broken pieces, but I could see in his face he didn't believe all of it. He believed I had gotten lost, that I was dehydrated, that exhaustion had played tricks on me. He didn't believe in the prints, the steady steps, the circling in the night. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Something followed me in those woods, step for step, patient and waiting. It never rushed, never tried to attack, just stayed there, reminding me that I wasn't alone, that I had wandered too deep into a place I wasn't meant to be. I haven't gone back since. I won't. The silence of the deep woods doesn't feel like peace to me anymore. It feels like something breathing, just out of sight, waiting for anyone foolish enough to step too far. I had never been afraid of the woods. All my life, I thought of the forest as a place of peace, where the air was cleaner, the noises were natural, and the only pressure came from the weight of my pack on my shoulders. I had gone on hikes and camping trips since I was a teenager, always enjoying how far I could go before running into another person. The deeper I got, the calmer I felt. I thought I understood the woods better than most people. I thought I knew what to expect. That trip changed that for me. It started with the same routine I always followed. I packed my tent, food, a decent knife, a small hatchet, a sleeping bag, a water filter, and everything else I'd normally take for 3 days alone. I didn't plan on seeing anyone. That was the point. I drove down the dirt road until my car couldn't go further, parked it near a trailhead I had found on a map, and shouldered my pack. It was warm that day, late summer, the air thick with humidity. Bugs were already buzzing around my arms as I stepped off the gravel and into the tree line. The path I followed was faint, more of a game trail than a human one. That's what I liked. The less human it looked, the better. My boots crushed down ferns and low brush as I walked deeper, the sound of the world fading until it was just the crunch of my steps and the occasional distant call of a bird. I moved steady, not rushing, letting the forest close around me. Hours passed. The sun shifted. The trail became less obvious. I checked my map, compass, and GPS once in a while, making sure I knew where I was. I always carried backups because I didn't want to be the kind of fool who relied on one device that could die in the middle of nowhere. By late afternoon, I reached a low clearing near a creek. The ground was soft, covered in pine needles, and there was enough flat space for my tent. I set down my pack and breathed in the smell of wet earth and sap. Setting up camp was muscle memory by then. Tent up, sleeping bag unrolled. Food hung high in a tree a little ways off to keep animals away. I filled my bottle from the creek and filtered it, watching the clear stream flow over stones dark with moss. Everything felt normal, but as evening came on, something about the forest felt different. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. Usually, in the woods, you hear life all around you. Birds, squirrels, insects buzzing so loud they fill your head. But as the light dimmed, it seemed like everything quieted down faster than normal. The trees stood still. The creek still flowed, but the space beyond it felt muted. I sat by the small fire I had built and tried to brush off the feeling. I told myself it was just because I was alone, and being alone in a place that big can play tricks on your head. I ate, listened to the occasional crack of a branch in the distance, and tried to relax. When I finally lay down in my tent, I left the fire to burn down to coals and zipped myself inside. For a while, I listened to the faint drip of water and the whisper of the breeze. My body was tired, but my mind wasn't ready to let go. Something in me kept waiting. That was when I heard it. It wasn't close. It wasn't even clear, but it was there, the sound of something moving where it shouldn't. At first, it was just a faint crunch, like a boot pressing on dry leaves. Then it stopped. Silence again. I held my breath, staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent. My ears strained. Nothing. Then, a few minutes later, another crunch. I tried to convince myself it was an animal. Deer move like that sometimes, careful, stopping, listening. But the weight of the sound, it felt heavier than a deer. And deer don't usually pause that long between steps. I lay still for over an hour, listening. The steps never came closer, but they also didn't fade. They came, stopped, started again. Always at a distance, always just enough to remind me something else was out there. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke, the fire was cold and gray. The sun was just coming up, throwing pale light between the trees. I crawled out of the tent and stretched, my back stiff from the thin pad beneath me. Everything looked normal. No tracks around camp. No signs that anything had been close. I tried to laugh at myself. The woods make noises. Trees fall. Animals walk. I was probably making it bigger in my head than it was. I packed a day bag with water and food and set out to explore. The creek bent north and I followed it upstream. The forest grew denser. Thick trunks rose around me, and the undergrowth tangled across my legs. I loved it, the rawness of it, the way it felt untouched. But the farther I went, the more I noticed something strange. The woods here felt scarred. Trees had been cut, but not cleanly like by an axe. Chunks were torn from the bark, long strips peeled down like something had scraped hard against them. Some saplings were snapped in half, not broken by storm but twisted, like they had been forced down. I stopped often to look, running my hand over the rough wood. My stomach tightened as I tried to picture what caused it. No storm I knew of could twist trees like that. By midday, I turned back. I didn't like the idea of being too far from camp without knowing the land better. On the way, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A pile of stones, stacked unnaturally, forming a crude little tower about waist high. It looked deliberate. The edges of the rocks were sharp, like they hadn't been moved long ago. Moss hadn't grown on them yet. I stood there staring at it for a long time. People made that. Someone had been out here, and recently. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the thought. The woods had always been where I went to be alone. If someone else was here, watching, I didn't know how I felt about that. That night was worse. I sat by the fire longer than usual, listening hard, scanning the dark. The noises came back again, slow steps in the distance. This time I was sure it wasn't an animal. The steps were too steady, too careful. Whoever it was, they knew I was here. I didn't sleep much. I woke often, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something outside my tent. At one point I sat up and just listened in the dark, knife in my hand, waiting for the zipper to move. It never did. By morning my nerves were frayed. I made the decision to cut my trip short. I could pack up, hike back, and be out by afternoon. But when I went to get my food bag from where I had hung it, it was gone. The rope was still there, swinging loose. The knot had been untied, not chewed through. My bag of food was gone without a trace. That was when real fear hit me. Animals don't untie knots. Someone had taken it, and they had done it while I was only yards away, sleeping. I felt exposed, like my skin was too thin for my body. I grabbed my gear and stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could. The plan was simple: get out. The woods didn't make that easy. I followed my compass south, the same direction I had come from, but the land felt different. Trails I thought I knew didn't look the same. Clearings had shifted. Fallen trees blocked routes I swore had been open before. I forced myself not to panic, but my throat was dry and my chest tight. Hours passed. The sun climbed and started to sink again. My legs ached. My water ran low. I still hadn't seen the road. Then I saw the stones. The same stacked pile I had seen before, except this time there were 3 of them side by side, in a line across the trail. I stopped dead. My mouth went dry. Whoever was out here wasn't just passing through. They were marking the land. Maybe marking me. The sound of a branch snapping somewhere deep in the trees sent me moving again. Faster this time, nearly running. I didn't care if I was noisy. I just wanted out. The woods grew darker as the sun dropped. I had no choice but to stop and set camp again. My legs couldn't carry me all night. I picked a spot against a slope, somewhere I could see around me better, and set no fire this time. I sat in the dark, clutching my knife, listening. The steps came back, this time closer. I froze, every muscle locked. The sound was slow, deliberate, circling. I couldn't see who it was. The dark was too thick, the trees too close. But I knew they were there. I didn't sleep at all. I waited, listening, until the first gray light of morning bled into the trees. When I finally stood, my body ached like I had aged years overnight. I forced myself forward, following the compass, step after step. My mind was raw, scraped down by fear and exhaustion. By midday, I heard something that almost made me collapse with relief. The faint rumble of a car engine, somewhere beyond the trees. I pushed harder, branches whipping against my face, my pack dragging at my shoulders. Finally, through the thinning trees, I saw the gravel road. My car sat just where I had left it, coated in dust, quiet and waiting. But as I stumbled closer, I saw something that froze me in place. On the hood of my car sat my missing food bag. It was neatly placed, folded shut, like a gift waiting for me. I always liked the idea of being alone in the woods, far away from noise and people. There was something about the quiet and the stillness that I thought would calm me, maybe even reset my mind after weeks of long work and endless stress. So one Friday afternoon, I packed up my backpack, stuffed it with food, water, my tent, sleeping bag, and a few small things I thought I might need, and I drove out toward a stretch of forest that was about 3 hours from the city. It wasn't a marked campground, not the kind of place with signs and toilets and friendly families roasting marshmallows. It was the kind of place you only knew about if you were willing to drive down dirt roads until they stopped, park your car where the brush nearly scraped the sides, and walk deep enough that the world behind you disappeared. I wanted that. I wanted no people, no cars, no cell service, just me and the woods. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be out for the weekend and back by Sunday evening. That small detail would later sit heavy in my stomach, but at the time I thought nothing of it. When I first started walking, the trees closed in around me fast. It was early evening by the time I parked, and the light was already low, slanting in at an angle that made everything golden. The ground was soft with old pine needles, and the air smelled heavy with damp earth. I pushed further in, finding faint game trails that twisted between tall trunks and brambles. I walked for almost an hour before I decided I was far enough. The silence back there was thick, not total silence. There were insects buzzing, the occasional bird flapping through the canopy, the sound of branches creaking, but silence in the sense that no trace of people existed there. I set up my tent in a small clearing, cleared away the sticks and pine cones, laid out my sleeping bag inside, and sat down on a log to eat something simple out of a bag. The light faded quicker than I thought, and before long the woods around me were swallowed in a deep blue shadow that turned black as night took over. I had my small lantern set on the ground, casting a soft circle of light, and for a while it felt good. The kind of quiet I thought I was searching for. But it wasn't long before that quiet started to feel too heavy. When you're out there, every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush feels sharper. I kept looking up, half expecting to see something moving just beyond the edge of the light, but I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. The first night passed without much happening. I lay in my tent listening to the forest shift and sigh, and eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I cooked myself a small breakfast on the little camp stove I brought, then decided I'd wander deeper, maybe see if I could find water. The map I had printed showed a small creek somewhere to the north. I figured if I found it, I'd refill my bottles and come back. I left my tent behind, locked up with the zipper, and started walking with just a day pack and knife clipped to my belt. It was strange how quickly the woods swallowed me. There were no marked trails, nothing easy to follow. I kept my compass in hand and moved north as best as I could, but the terrain was uneven, full of dips, ridges, and thick undergrowth. After maybe 40 minutes, I finally heard water and soon came across the creek. It was narrow but running, clear enough that I could see small rocks at the bottom. I crouched down, washed my face, and filled my bottles with the help of my filter pump. As I was kneeling there, I noticed something across the creek. At first, I thought it was just a pile of branches, maybe the remains of a deadfall, but the shape caught my eye. It looked wrong, like something had been stacked. I crossed over on a few stones and went closer. It was sticks, yes, but not random. They had been leaned together, a small crude shelter, almost like a lean-to, except it didn't look lived in. It wasn't big enough for a person, more like something a child might build. Around it were bits of things half buried in the dirt. A broken piece of a plastic cup, a shoe sole, a scrap of fabric faded nearly gray. Old things, weathered, but out of place this deep in the woods. I felt uneasy staring at it. It looked abandoned, but it also looked intentional, like someone had been there once, maybe even recently. The silence around it made the hair on the back of my neck rise. I didn't want to linger, so I filled my bottles quickly and started heading back south. But the woods didn't feel the same. I tried to retrace my steps, looking for landmarks, but the deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't walking the same way I came. The trees all looked the same. I checked my compass and forced myself to keep going south. I told myself I'd eventually hit the clearing where my tent was. After nearly 2 hours of walking, I knew I was lost. My stomach sank hard. The sun was higher now, the heat pressing down, and I was sweating heavily under my pack. I stopped to rest, tried to calm down, tried to remember the training videos and articles I had read about what to do when you're lost. Don't panic. Stay put. Signal. Conserve energy. I sat there for a while, drinking small sips of water, but I couldn't shake the thought of that strange shelter by the creek. Who had built it? Why had there been scraps of things around it? When I finally stood up and decided to move again, I swore I heard something behind me, a soft crunch of leaves. I froze, turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just still trunks and heavy undergrowth. I listened, my pulse hammering in my ears. After a minute, I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. I moved again, quicker this time, checking over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. By late afternoon, I stumbled back into a clearing, and to my relief, I saw my tent. I almost laughed out loud from the relief, but my throat was too dry for it. I dropped my pack and sat down on the ground, catching my breath. That night, though, the woods felt different. I kept my lantern lit longer, too nervous to let the dark fully close in. I barely ate, my stomach knotted with nerves. I crawled into my tent and zipped it tight, but I lay awake listening. At some point, deep in the night, I heard footsteps. Not animals. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps moving through the brush. They circled the clearing, not close enough to see, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. I held my breath, every muscle locked, my knife gripped tight in my hand. The steps would pause, then start again, shifting around the perimeter. I never heard them leave. When morning came, my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I stepped out of the tent, looking for prints. Anything. The ground was too hard, covered in needles, but I swore I saw scuffs in the dirt, spots where someone had stood too long. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. I packed up everything in a rush, stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack, and started walking back toward the car. Except I couldn't find the road. The woods twisted on themselves, and after hours of walking, I realized I was only getting deeper. My map and compass told me one thing, but the terrain didn't match. I tried to push on anyway, but by afternoon, I came across something that froze me in place. It was the same lean-to shelter by the creek. Only this time, it looked different. New sticks had been added. The scraps I had seen before were gone, and in the dirt near it, I saw a clear footprint. A boot print, fresh. That was when I knew I wasn't alone out there. The fear that crept through me was like nothing I'd ever felt. I backed away slowly, then turned and started moving as fast as I could, pushing through brush and brambles until my arms and legs were cut and scratched. I didn't care. I just wanted out. That night, I didn't even set up my tent. I huddled against a fallen log, trying to stay low, listening to the woods breathe. I didn't light my lantern. I didn't eat. I just sat there, waiting. The footsteps came again, closer this time, slow, patient, circling. Sometimes they stopped completely, and the silence pressed in so hard it hurt. I could almost feel eyes on me, though I couldn't see anything. I stayed like that until the sky began to lighten with dawn. I forced myself up, my body stiff and aching, and I walked again. My water was low, my food nearly gone, but I didn't stop. I moved all day, hoping to hear traffic, to see power lines, anything. Instead, I came across something worse. In another small clearing, there was a second shelter, bigger, built stronger, with branches tied together with old rope and strips of cloth. Inside it, there were things: a rusted can, a burned-out lantern, a torn backpack, and bones. Small animal bones, cracked open, scattered. The smell around it was faint but sour. I staggered back, my throat closing. Someone had been living out here, not camping, living, hiding, watching, and they knew I was here. Panic took over then. I ran. I didn't care where. I crashed through the trees until I could barely breathe, my lungs burning, my legs weak. At some point, I fell hard, scraping my hands and knees, but I forced myself up and kept going. By nightfall, I was beyond exhaustion. I couldn't stop shaking. I collapsed against another tree, too weak to keep going. My body I always thought the woods were quiet, peaceful places. I grew up around smaller forests, the kind of places where trails were clear, where you could hear cars on a road not too far away, where you never really felt alone even if you thought you were. But these woods were different. They were endless. The kind of place where the air felt heavier, where even a short walk turned into something that felt like miles, and where sounds didn't carry the same way. I had gone out there with the idea of just being away for a while, camping alone, thinking it would help me clear my head. I carried a tent, a pack, food, the usual gear. I thought I was prepared. I thought I knew enough. The trailhead had looked simple at first, and I had even parked my car by the side of the gravel lot, noting a couple of other vehicles. It gave me some comfort that I wasn't completely alone in the area, though I didn't see anyone as I started walking. The path narrowed quickly, the trees crowding in, branches twisting above me like they were trying to shut out the sky. The deeper I went, the less I heard anything that tied me to people. No far-off highway, no voices, not even the hum of planes. Just the woods and me. I hiked until late afternoon, passing thick clusters of pine and patches of moss that seemed to swallow the ground whole. The smell was damp earth and old leaves. At one point, I saw a set of tracks in the mud, boot prints, maybe a couple of days old. They veered off the path into thicker brush. I didn't think much of it at the time. By the time I set up camp, the light was fading. I picked a spot in a small clearing, a patch of dirt between tall pines, and laid out my tent. I built a small fire from dead branches, watching the flames spit and crackle, sending thin smoke upward where it got lost in the heavy canopy. I cooked a bit of food on my small stove, listened to the fire pop, and tried to let myself settle. The first night wasn't too bad. The usual sounds came: crickets, the shifting of leaves high above, the occasional snap of a branch somewhere out in the dark. I told myself it was animals. Out there, everything moved. I pulled my sleeping bag tight and let the fire burn low until sleep took me. The second day, I hiked farther. I wanted to push deeper into the woods. I thought maybe I could make a loop, circle back around to the trailhead in a couple of days. I carried my pack lighter this time, leaving some gear at camp. The forest grew thicker as I went. The ground was uneven, roots everywhere. A few times, I had to climb over fallen trees that looked like they had been there for decades, bark peeled away and soft under my boots. I noticed less sunlight the deeper I went. The canopy above blocked it out, and in some places it felt like late evening even though I knew it was only noon. As I walked, I noticed more prints. Some were animal, deer maybe. Others were boots, like the ones I had seen the day before. But they didn't seem to follow the same path. They crossed, circled, then disappeared. I tried to ignore the twist in my gut when I saw them. The woods had hunters, maybe, or someone else out hiking. It didn't mean anything. By the time I turned back, I was sweating hard and thirsty. My legs felt heavy, and the silence pressed closer. When I made it back to camp, the first thing I noticed was that something was wrong. My fire ring, where I had left ashes and half-burnt sticks, was scattered, not just by wind. It looked like someone had kicked through it. My pack was still there, but the flap was open. I froze. My food bags had been torn, some of them gone, others spilled out across the dirt. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear. But then I saw the way the straps of my pack were unclipped, not ripped. They had been opened. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees around me. The woods were quiet, too quiet. My skin prickled. I gathered what I could, pulled everything into my tent, and sat inside with the zipper closed. I told myself maybe it was raccoons. They could be smart, but raccoons didn't unclip buckles. They didn't kick through fire rings. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me stiffen in the dark, heart hammering. Something moved once, close enough to the tent that I could hear leaves crunch. I held my breath until it passed. The next morning, I debated leaving, packing everything up and heading straight back to the trailhead. But something in me resisted. I told myself I was just spooked, that leaving now would feel like defeat. I forced myself to stay, though I packed everything tighter, keeping my knife close by. That day, I didn't hike as far. I stayed closer to camp, though I wandered a bit to gather more wood. It was when I circled back that I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the dirt, near the edge of the clearing, were fresh prints. Boot prints. Not mine. They were heavier, wider, and pointed directly toward my tent before turning away into the trees. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I looked around, my breathing shallow. The woods were still. Nothing moved, but I felt it. That thick, pressing weight, like I wasn't alone anymore. I backed into camp, my eyes on the tree line, and tried to tell myself it didn't mean what I thought it meant. But deep down, I knew someone had been here. Someone had walked right up to where I slept. I didn't start a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, knife in my hand, ears straining for every sound. Once, I thought I saw movement between the trees, a darker shape among shadows. My eyes watered from staring too hard. Hours dragged by, each minute louder in my head. By morning, I had made up my mind. I had to get out. The trailhead was miles away, but I couldn't risk staying. I packed fast, shoving everything into my pack, and started walking back the way I had come. My steps were quick, uneven, like I expected something to rush out at me any second. The woods felt different on the way back. I kept seeing things that didn't look right. A tree trunk with fresh cuts in it, like someone had taken a blade to mark it. Piles of stones stacked unnaturally, balanced one on top of another. A rope tied around a branch, frayed at the end. Each one made me feel sicker. Each one told me I wasn't imagining it. At one point, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, steady. I spun around, but the path was empty. The silence after was worse than the sound. I didn't stop moving. My shoulders burned from the weight of the pack, but I didn't dare rest. The hours dragged. The trail didn't look familiar anymore. I should have reached the car by late afternoon, but the woods seemed to stretch endlessly. Every bend in the path led to another stretch of the same twisted trees, the same uneven roots. My throat was dry. Panic crept in. By the time the sun started to dip, I stumbled into a clearing. At first, I thought I had found the lot. Relief hit me like a wave until I saw what was there. In the dirt, in the center of the clearing, was my fire ring, my tent, my pack. I was back at my camp. I stood frozen, my mind blank. I had walked all day straight, following what I thought was the trail back, and somehow ended up right where I started. I dropped to my knees, shaking, trying to make sense of it. My prints were everywhere, but over them were others, heavier, circling, watching. I didn't stay. I ran. I left the camp behind, pack bouncing against my shoulders, lungs burning. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it wasn't there. The woods blurred together. Branches whipped my face. At some point, I tripped and hit the ground hard, my knife skidding away. I scrambled up, skin scraped raw, and kept moving. Night fell fast. The dark swallowed everything. I kept hearing it behind me. Not footsteps exactly, but the weight of someone out there, matching me, never too close, never too far. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. When dawn came, I dragged myself up again. My body ached. My lips cracked from thirst. I stumbled downhill, hoping lower ground would mean water, a stream, something. Instead, I found another clearing. In the center, hanging from a tree branch, was one of my food bags, torn open, empty. Beneath it, prints. That was when it hit me fully. I wasn't lost. I wasn't wandering in circles by accident. Someone was keeping me here. I don't know how many days it went on. My sense of time broke. I would walk, find strange things. Scraps of cloth tied to branches, carvings in bark. Sometimes even my own gear moved or torn apart. I hardly slept. I hardly ate. My body felt like it was running on fear alone. And then, finally, I heard something new. A motor, distant at first, then closer. I stumbled toward the sound, crashing through brush, branches tearing at me. I broke out of the trees onto a dirt road. A truck sat idling, two men loading gear into the back. They looked at me like I was an animal. I must have looked like one, wild-eyed, filthy, shaking. I didn't speak, couldn't. I just staggered forward, pointing behind me into the trees. One of them came closer, cautious, asking something I couldn't even process. I never liked traveling too far into the woods, but sometimes I felt the pull of being away from everything, away from noise and people, just the quiet stretch of trees and the air that always smelled sharper than the city. The idea of camping alone had been sitting in my head for weeks. I told myself it would be just a simple escape, one night in the deep woods with a fire and my small tent. I wanted to see if I could handle the quiet without the comfort of knowing someone else was close by. I thought it would be good for me, that it would toughen me up a little. I packed light but made sure I had what mattered. My tent was rolled tight and strapped to the bottom of my pack. I carried a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a couple of lighters, a small first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, and enough food to last me 2 days. I had trail mix, beef jerky, and a couple of cans of beans. My backpack wasn't heavy, but it pulled at my shoulders enough to remind me I was leaving behind comfort. I didn't bring my phone. At the last second, I left it in the car, telling myself I didn't want to look at a glowing screen when I could be looking at the trees. The parking lot where I left my car was small and cracked. There were only 2 other cars there. I glanced at them but didn't think much. I tightened the straps of my pack and started walking. The trail began clean and easy, packed dirt with faint shoe prints. The sun was behind me, sinking slow, turning the tops of the trees into fire-colored edges. The air cooled down the deeper I walked, damp and filled with the smell of moss and wet leaves. After about an hour, the trail split into 2. The left was marked, a bright wooden sign pointing toward a lake I had read about online. The right had no sign, only a narrow dirt path, barely wide enough for one person. That was the way I chose. I told myself I wanted to be away from people, that if anyone else was camping, they would be at the lake. I wanted quiet, and the unmarked trail looked like it could give me that. My boots sank a little in the soil as I walked. The air grew stiller. I noticed no birdsong, just the crunch of my own steps, the sound of fabric rubbing each time I shifted the weight of my pack. The path wound through dense brush. Sometimes I had to push branches aside, and they snapped back against my arms and jacket. I walked until I couldn't hear the main trail anymore, until I felt like the trees had closed behind me. I reached a small clearing just before dark. It wasn't much, just a space where the trees opened enough for me to pitch my tent. The ground was mostly flat, with only a few roots poking through. I dropped my pack, rolled my shoulders, and stood still for a long moment. The silence pressed against me. I couldn't hear the distant hum of cars. No voices, no signs of anyone. It was exactly what I asked for, and yet it felt heavier than I imagined. I set up my tent quickly, my hands moving faster than I thought they could. The nylon crinkled in the still air, and the sound echoed sharper than it should have. I laid out my sleeping bag inside and placed my flashlight within reach near the flap. I gathered some dry sticks and small branches from the edge of the clearing. My lighter flicked, and soon the fire caught. The small flames lit the trunks of the trees, throwing long shadows that leaned and shifted. I sat by the fire, chewing jerky, and staring at the black between the trees. The flames snapped and hissed. I tried not to think about how alone I was. My mind played tricks, shaping figures in the dark, but each time I blinked, the shapes were gone. The woods at night are not like they are during the day. In daylight, the trees look alive, soft in their green. At night, they become hard walls, shutting you in. Every sound stretches. A crack of a branch somewhere out there made me sit up straighter. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But when it didn't happen again, I couldn't shake the thought that something had paused too, like it was listening to me. I stayed awake longer than I meant to. The fire burned down low, orange embers breathing faint heat. My eyelids grew heavy, but each time I started to drift, I forced them open. Finally, I gave in, crawled into the tent, zipped the flap tight, and pulled the sleeping bag up around me. My heart beat too fast for sleep, but exhaustion won. Sometime in the night, I woke up. It wasn't because of cold or dreams. I woke because I heard something. Faint sound. Slow. Deliberate. Leaves shifting outside my tent. Then the soft crunch of weight pressed onto damp soil. I froze. My breath caught. My first thought was animal, maybe a deer sniffing around. I held still, waiting for the sound of hooves scuffing, for the shuffle of an animal moving on. But it didn't sound like that. It was too careful. Not like an animal at all. It was slower. Step, pause. Step, pause. My skin prickled. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. My fingers closed around the handle of my knife. The sound circled, not close to the tent, but not far either. Each step seemed to stop, then start again from another angle, like someone was walking around the edge of my clearing. I didn't move. My ears strained. The noise went on for what felt like forever, then stopped. The silence after was worse. I laid awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife inside my sleeping bag, my heart pounding against my ribs. When the first gray light touched the tent, I unzipped the flap and peered out. The clearing looked the same. The trees stood quiet, the ground wet with dew. But when I stepped outside, I saw something in the dirt just beyond the fire pit. A footprint. It wasn't mine. My boots had thick tread, sharp lines. This was different. Bare. A human foot. Long, narrow, pressed into the soft earth. Faced the tent. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at it, trying to think of any reason it could be there. Maybe a hiker? But why barefoot this deep in the woods at night? My skin went cold. I packed up fast, stuffing my sleeping bag and tent into my pack without care. I poured dirt over the ashes of the fire, slung the straps over my shoulders, and started back the way I thought I had come. The trail wasn't clear anymore. In my rush, everything looked the same. I walked straight, then turned, certain I was heading the right direction. After an hour, the trees didn't look familiar. I didn't see the broken branch I had noticed the day before, or the split oak I thought I had passed. My legs ached from the weight of the pack. I kept moving, telling myself I'd find the main trail again. But the deeper I went, the quieter it grew. The air felt thicker. Then I noticed something worse. In the soft soil, half covered by fallen leaves, more footprints. Bare. Moving in the same direction I was. I stopped cold. My mouth went dry. The prints were fresh, edges still sharp, not blurred by rain or wind. Whoever it was had passed not long before me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but the silence pressed harder now, like it was holding its breath. I forced myself to keep walking. My pack rubbed raw spots into my shoulders. My throat burned, but I didn't stop to drink. Every so often, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. The footprints kept showing up. Sometimes they vanished on dry ground, then appeared again in mud or soft dirt. Always ahead of me, always leading me deeper. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray, clouds thickened, and the air smelled like rain. I knew if I didn't find the trail soon, I'd be stuck in the storm. I found another small clearing and decided I couldn't go on much longer. My legs trembled. My pack felt like stone. I dropped everything and sat on a log, trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. At the far edge of the clearing, low in the brush, something stuck out. Fabric. I stood slowly and walked toward it. A shirt, dirty, torn, crumpled into the mud. I picked it up, then dropped it just as fast. It was damp with more than rain. Dark stains marked the chest. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. My eyes darted around the clearing. Suddenly, I saw more. A shoe lying on its side near a fallen tree. A torn piece of backpack strap tangled in roots. My skin crawled. I turned to grab my pack and leave, but froze again. On the ground, only a few feet from where I had been sitting, another footprint. Bare. Pointed toward me. I didn't think. I grabbed my pack, left the clearing at a run, branches whipping my arms and face. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I just needed out. Felt endless. The trees blurred. My chest heaved. Then, finally, through the thick brush, I saw something. A trail marker. Faded paint on a wooden post. Relief hit so hard my knees buckled. I followed it, stumbling, gasping, until I heard it. The faint hum of the road. Then the sight of the small cracked parking lot. My car still sat there. The other two cars were gone. I didn't look back as I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and slammed it shut.